Welcome back to an over-analysis of every boss encounter, and yes, I do mean every boss encounter, in Elden Ring. If you haven't had the chance to see the first part, I'll likely be referring to that one a few times in this video, particularly in regards to movesets for bosses that have already appeared once before. The video is linked in the description below. There are 164 bosses, and though I've played Elden Ring 3 times, I am by no means a professional Elden Ring player. Where we last left off, we had gone over the encounters of Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, and Liurnia. Before we head over to Caelid, the next of those big starting regions, we're going to head down to the Ainsel and Siofra rivers. So, let's dive into the mid-game with part 2 of this analysis, and the shortest area in all of Elden Ring. Walking into the chamber of the Dragonkin Soldier of Nokstella is one of my favorite moments of my first playthrough. This statue was on the loading screen throughout the entire game, and anyone familiar with FromSoft knew that a boss was going to drop down into here. Despite not being a remembrance boss, the Dragonkin boasts a scale and design philosophy a lot larger than the rest of his fellows. The name of the game with the Dragonkin is Spectacle, oftentimes to its own detriment. The monster is beaten in terms of size only by a few late-game opponents who'll dive even further into that spectacle. Every attack here has long delays and will create sparks, rocks, and dirt that tear from the ground, often obscuring the view, especially when combined with water splash effects, which happily cover your entire screen anytime the Dragonkin goes for an attack. Unlike the ulcerated Tree Spirit, another large boss that often started its attacks from off-screen, the tempo of the Dragonkin's attacks is much more varied, which is great for humanoid bosses, but can make dodging the attacks feel unnatural against a boss of this size. Particularly once the second phase variations of attacks enter the mix, there are a lot of times that learning this fight means that you'll dodge just a little early or just a little late for a punch that you knew was coming, even though you couldn't see it. That slightly off timing between variations of punches wouldn't be as much of an issue if it weren't for the fact that this boss also restricts player mobility a lot. The Dragonkin keeps low to the ground, which isn't inherently bad, but with his legs spread out and his upper torso often coming low to the ground, repositioning is easier said than done, as it's easy to get stuck between his arm and leg and struggle to move out of an AoE zone that, again, you know is about to hit right where you're standing. I know the vertical attacks wouldn't be possible to jump, but it is possible some of these horizontal ones may be jumpable. There are times where dodging isn't even worth trying, though. If you can't get out, why not go for more attacks, and roll if you have the timing in your mind. The tells between these variations also don't really do their job well. Every attack is some variation of the Dragonkin raising his arm into the air, to the point that even its death initially looks like it's going for another attack. The AoE threats are varied in a vacuum, but too tough to tell apart as they begin. After releasing a huge electric AoE to begin his second phase, the Dragonkin will gain more damage and even more spectacle-focused attacks. He gains AoE after effects on his swings that start to deal frostbite, and gains the ability to fly back to use one of 2 distance-focused attacks. One of them is this flyby attack across the arena that I absolutely adore. It looks great and feels awesome to dodge through. The lightning bolt attack is fun the first time around, creating a minefield of bolts that strike down in front of him, but he can spam it like nobody's business. And it's a tough attack to press in during, especially considering how easy it is to be hit by one bolt after you dodged another one. Strangely, there are 3 Dragonkin soldiers in Elden Ring. One of them is not a boss encounter, but is found later in this same river without a second phase and with more health. The final version is found closer to the endgame, and though it has about 80% more health, it also lacks the second phase found here. The phase change is exclusive to this encounter. It's a strange choice to introduce the most complicated version of a boss you plan to have make reappearances as the first version of that foe players will often encounter. Unlike the Leon and Misbegotten, the rivers are better hidden and a reward for deep exploration compared to the peninsula's more tutorial-focused zone, which makes this boss's later demotion feel almost out of place. I'd give the Dragonkin Soldier of Nokstella a C grade. I love the boss's introduction and placement, but the combat just doesn't click for me, lacking that satisfying punch to his attacks that makes dodging even the flailing attacks of the ulcerated Tree Spirit occasionally entertaining. Even with that, the excitement of finding the battle and the spectacle he offers still creates a fairly memorable battle. The Ancestor Spirit, meanwhile, is an excellent atmosphere-focused encounter. When you walk into the arena, having communed with the corpse of a giant deer, You see this silhouette. Then it turns and starts to move towards you, speeding up as it goes. This design is spectacular, and the Ancestor Spirit's musical theme is easily one of my favorite tracks in Elden Ring. Most of the Ancestor Spirit's attacks are bestial, stomps and headbutts that, aside from a delayed front stomp, keep to an easy-to-follow rhythm. There are a few faster strikes that are great at catching the player off guard without being too unfair, while also leaning into that wild, unpredictable nature of fighting a beast. The second half of the moveset is where the spirit really does come into its own as an encounter though. Using either a breath weapon that trails on the ground behind it as it walks, or leaping into the air and gracefully stepping on nothing before coming crashing down in a stomp, or leaving a trail of breath that cuts the player off. Combined with the sorrowful music, the beauty of the raging, dilapidated creature is put into full focus. The instrumentation, combined with the cries of what feel like wild animals, create this gorgeous atmosphere. One issue is that, like Margit, the Ancestor Spirit is only half the battle, a simpler version of the later Remembrance boss. And unfortunately, unlike Margit, there's not as much done between the encounters to justify the earlier version. Part of the thing that makes the spirit work so well as an atmospheric boss fight is the shock of the sorrowful melody melded with a moveset that juxtaposes the violent attacks with the almost divine depiction of grace. And though the regal Ancestor Spirit will add more elements to the design and fight that will push that theming forward, the Ancestor Spirit doesn't build up to it in any way. It ends up becoming an earlier version that spoiled the biggest pieces of that later battle. Because of that, I think the Ancestor Spirit loses some points for failing to successfully build up the regal Ancestor Spirit. I think the Ancestor Spirit earns a high B grade. It would be an A grade in a vacuum, but Elden Ring is not a vacuum. It's an entire experience, especially when it comes to boss battles like the Ancestor Spirits. And now, it begins. We've seen one duo fight prior to this in the Crystalians, and though that enemy design theoretically lended itself to a duo fight, the Mad Pumpkin Heads were a strange choice. Their health is increased enough to pose more of a threat from the initial showing, having around 2800 health each, but considering how long a window the player gets at the start of the fight to land free hits, the combined 5600 health pool is not nearly as intimidating as you'd expect. Both use flaming weapons, and one uses the same moveset as the Limgrave variant, whereas the other wields a huge club. I don't have much footage of it here, but the club has a lot more presence as a boss than the original moveset. The spinning attack is satisfying and rhythmic to dodge, and goes on just a little longer than you think it would, which I personally love. To accommodate two foes, the room is significantly larger than it was in its first iteration, and though the first arena would have been too restrictive, I think this room goes a little too far in the opposite direction. It changes it from a claustrophobic fight to a battle with plenty of space. Even with two enemies chasing after you, there's still plenty of room once you consider that the Mad Pumpkin Heads are slower foes. The big issue comes from the fact that the Mad Pumpkin Heads are not built to be a duo fight. They can work well as elite mobs in the overworld, surrounded by smaller enemies, but when they're put next to another one of itself, the choice of clearing out less threatening foes to more easily sneak behind the Pumpkinhead, or to target the Pumpkinhead while harassed, is gone. Even with the varied movesets occasionally making gaps, at the end of the day, the enemy's range are both fairly short, leaving them often standing on top of each other. It doesn't make for a very dynamic battle. I'll get into it in more detail later, but there was actually a pretty significant patch that nerfed duo fights, which a comment in the first video brought up. I think that's a good thing to mention here, because it'll be a while before I talk about it in more detail. I think the Mad Pumpkin Heads earn a D grade. I like the hammer version of the enemy in a boss setting, but the things that made the first Pumpkinhead stand out even a little have vanished in this battle. Around Caelid or the Altus Plateau is when the bosses that succeeded in the early game really need to start evolving. And though most of the rematches do boast some new mechanic, whether it be more enemies, Scarlet Rot to match the area's aesthetics, the Knight's Cavalry remain exactly the same as the first four appearances. The health is a little higher, jumping up another 500 from the Liurnia twins, but that doesn't make it stick out. There is also a ton of small walls and mushrooms that make the cavalry's pathing look really messy here. Compared to the atmosphere of the Knight Rider look from the peninsula or in the forest in southern Liurnia, this one is just on a road. There's no framing for the enemy, nothing that makes it stick out. It almost feels like a non-boss. Most of the other Knight's Cavalries still had enough presence to earn their health bar, but this one really doesn't. Lose the health bar and you're left with a well-made, unique enemy that is easier to take down than the tougher enemies in the area around it. This is the weakest Knights Cavalry so far, resting near the bottom of a C grade. It's a fine fight, but it lacks any real presence as an encounter. And as a nighttime boss, presence is critical. The Deathbird has evolved to make sure players still fear the Knight, and the Knights Cavalry needed to do the same thing. Speaking of evolving to fit the area, there's few bosses that do it as smoothly as the Putrid Avatar. Building on the Erdtree Avatar's moveset, the Putrid Avatar does 3 things to escalate the battle's tension. The first is visual. The Erdtree Avatar was the simple design, and the additional dead leaves at the end of what look like branches do a great job making the Avatar look wrong and sickly. Especially with how well the first Avatars established the wood and stone themes, it does a lot to push Caelid's design more into the horror aspect that the red sky set up. After all, even the great trees have gone rotten in the miasma. The second and third change go hand in hand. The Putrid Avatar boasts higher resistances to most statuses, and a complete immunity to everything poison and rot, which works both for lore and escalating the challenge. With it, it adds a Scarlet Rot spray to the classic Butt Slam. I still prefer this Butt Slam to a lot of the huge magical AoEs that large creatures use. The spray is easy enough to dodge that it plays into the best way to fight the enemy. The evolutions here are both great, and the Putrid Avatar serves as a solid level check early on in the region. It's easy to stumble into Caelid underleveled, and finding the tree only to be matched with the high damage and 1,000 more health than the Liurnia versions means a player still working through Limgrave will be harshly pushed back into the greenery for a little while longer. There's one more design decision that initially felt strange, but the more I think about it, the more I love it. The Putrid Avatar, despite changing all the rest of its aesthetics, keeps the golden magic attacks. Considering everything else was adjusted and corrupted, I was a bit confused as to why this attack wasn't. But at the end of the day, it's because the force being built up with that golden light, the Elden Beast, the final boss, is meant to be greater than any rot. For even the rot that brought Caelid to its knees cannot stand against the Elden Beast. This design, pretty subtly and pretty cleverly, builds towards that. Resting just above his clean clones, the Putrid Avatar earns another B grade. It still misses out on the A grade for its simplicity, but the enemy hasn't yet overstayed its welcome, and the placement along the path just inside Caelid does a great job warning players of the challenge without demanding the same commitment that a dungeon does. Like the Mad Pumpkinheads, the Erdtree Burial Watchdogs also get doubled in Caelid. Around the late mid-game is when Watchdogs will begin to make the jump from boss to enemy, which makes this encounter feel like a final iteration of the foe. Even though it's not, we'll run into that later. Both have the 3-headed upgrade for the large fire breath, and one uses the sword for repeated jumps and swings, while the other uses the staff, meaning ranged attacks alongside a slightly easier to predict melee moveset. Like in the Peninsula variation, you'll see a lot more of the Watchdog's standing slam and jumping attacks, only rarely getting to see any of the melee moveset, which is good because the melee moveset's bizarre timings overlap even more than these ones already do. Like the Mad Pumpkinheads, the total HP of these two sit around 5,600, so each Watchdog has about 300 more than the Liurnia version did. Unlike the Mad Pumpkinheads, there is no free damage at the start of the battle. Every point of damage here does need to be earned. The Erdtree Burial Watchdog is not designed to be an enemy in a duo fight, and though it fits the format better than the Pumpkinheads, it does not come without its own significant issues, the worst of which is the jumping slam. Since it always stays airborne for a set amount of time while it floats to wherever the player is, there are a lot of times that you can see 2 slams slightly off in timing, making them near impossible to dodge. The ranged magic works great, and the walking slam can serve as an opportunity to control the distance between the Watchdogs to get attacks to line up better, but especially when the sword-wielding Watchdog is slamming down 3 times, it can become incredibly frustrating to also deal with jumps and slams from the staff variation. Unlike the Mad Pumpkinheads, the arena here has not changed, which I do love. The Watchdogs never fully took up their arena space, and 2 of them are able to fill it significantly better than the one ever could. Though there are still frustrating attacks, it feels infinitely better than the Peninsula Watchdogs' ill-balanced health and imps. The animations of the Watchdogs are still the main focus of the creature design here, which pays off in the atmosphere they're relying upon. I know this fight in particular gets a lot of hate, and part of that might also be the patch that nerfed duo fights. But I think it's a serviceable duo battle in its current state. Nothing spectacular, but worthy of a C grade. The health is high enough to be a challenge, but not high enough to make the fight drag on. There were two boss encounters that I forgot to hit record on for this playthrough, and since I'm using this katana build in the DLC right now, that means that Battlemage Hughes is the first of the two bosses that you'll be seeing the main build that I played through the game with. Unfortunately for Battlemage Hughes, the stat boosts of New Game Plus 2 are not enough to make him pose a threat. Sitting at just over 4,000 hit points on New Game, Hughes does have a little more heft than each of the individuals in the duo fights, but not enough for how easy he is to knock around. Stagger can stop him from doing almost anything, making it easy to overwhelm and beat him down at almost no risk to yourself. Considering the attacks leave larger than usual windows to attack after, he doesn't present enough of a threat as a boss, even among other bosses that are later converted to enemies. Going back to record this footage was the first time I touched this character or Elden Ring since this katana playthrough, which at this point was a few months ago, and he still couldn't do anything to catch me off guard. I also misspoke with the Cleanrot Knight, since Hughes wasn't correctly on my list initially. The primary threat of the Battle Mage, however, comes from challenges in terrain or strength in numbers in the late game, something this fight does not offer at all. When he staggers so easily every hit and he's in a open circle, what moves he does have don't really matter. And even within that moveset, it's pretty restricted. He can headbutt the player, swing once with his club, or swing multiple times back and forth, slowly enough that he's pretty easy to interrupt between swings. All of these attacks are really easy to punish. He has two spells. One creates soul arrows that, like with Smaragd, struggle to track the player and are interruptible. His last spell creates a huge magical hammer with a long windup that creates a magic AoE when it lands. This is certainly the most interesting move in his arsenal, as it looks and feels unique, but one good move is not enough to make Hughes feel deserving of this health bar. I think Hughes earns a low D grade. Fun fact, on his wiki page, his strength is listed as magic. Every physical damage is listed as his weakness. In the third appearance, the Cemetery Shade is back to a one-on-one, though his damage remained at the higher point. I'm glad to see the enemy back to a straightforward duel because the design does work much better in that environment. With that said, the boss is still over way too fast. This is the final encounter with the Cemetery Shade as a boss, and even in Caelid, where mages boasted 4,000 hit points and duo fights at 2,800 each, the Cemetery Shade still has under 1,500 health. Considering the damage a player can dish out at this point, that means that rushing the enemy down here is still the best strategy. I wish that the Cemetery Shade had a definitive fight. Both here and in the peninsula, the health felt so restricted, and I loathe the version with skeletons. It's a frantic enemy, even if it does occasionally push to be a little too fast, that can make solid use of the bleed status in a way other bosses can't. And though I'm glad they didn't drop it into a duo fight, this doesn't feel like a good final battle. It's a sad place to end the boss template on. I'd say it's about neck and neck with the first variation, earning another D grade. It ends up a sad climax to the boss. Now what's more threatening than 2 Crystallians? 3 Crystallians with Scarlet Rot damage on their attacks. This is by far the most endurant we've ever seen the Crystallians. All 3 of the Liurnia Crystallians had 1,595 health, and all 3 here have 3,398. They can take a lot more of a beating, and it makes the individual tempo of each enemy feel a lot more satisfying. Considering most Liurnia bosses got a 500 to 1,000 increase, 3 bosses all over doubling their health does give a lot more heft and length to the fight. And though 2 Crystallians struggled to work together after the nerf, I'm sure 3 of them will finally present a successful multi-boss threat. Nope, they still got nerfed a little too hard. The spear enemy is the only one capable of putting on real pressure, and the staff version somehow feels even worse at things now. He's just spinning back there, he's not even using magic. The increased health means we finally get to see some of their movesets, which is great for the Ringblade version that finally gets to show off some really cool attacks. Like I said though, this is after some nerfs. I didn't personally encounter them prior to it, but this fight was apparently one of the battles where the enemies were so aggressive and so frequently overlapped that the nerf ended up being required. It's hard to look at this and see that fight, which goes a long way to show what some AI restrictions can do. I don't think the nerfs worked because they took the Crystallians a little bit too far. The fact there's 3 of them becomes irrelevant, which kind of ruins the entire gimmick of this huge fight. They do add some Scarlet Rot to their attacks, and in the same way that the existence of Holy Light on the Putrid avatar made the light feel powerful, the rot seeping its way into the rocks makes it feel powerful. The bright red and pink nature of the rot attacks sticks against the usual faded blues the Crystallians have, and it makes these variations really stand out. Though the increased health makes this my favorite of the fights yet, it doesn't earn higher than a degrade. I think it's better than it would have been with them going fully aggressive, but just what is the mage doing back there? They were not nerfed, they were defanged. It wasn't until I made this list that I realized exactly how many boss fights in Caelids are rematches with a boss in a 2-on-1 battle. We had the Pumpkinheads, the Watchdogs, the Crystalians went from 2 to 3, and now the Cleanrot Knights are here. The fight starts 1-on-1 against a Cleanrot Knight with 42 more hit points than the Liurnia variant, and as you can see with the levels I've gained since then, that's pretty bad news for the Knight. After a short time passes, I think around 15 seconds, a second Cleanrot Knight will have climbed up and out of the murk around the arena wielding a sickle instead of a spear. Unlike the Mad Pumpkinheads, the first Cleanrot Knight is putting up a defense, which means it's not as easy to get the free damage in. The arena is far less of an issue than it was in the first battle. Though there are still Scarlet Rot pools to add to the atmosphere of the Knights, it serves a much more decorative role here. Particularly since the second knot will rise up out of the rot to face you down, it feels more like an aesthetic choice than a challenge. The unique arena feels great though, even if it doesn't provide the poison challenge that the first Knight relied on. Most of the interesting design here is happening with the sickle version, the second to appear. With the spear up first, the player's instinct will be to take it down first. Now this isn't a bad idea, especially if you have enough damage to kill or nearly kill the spear before the duo fight begins in earnest, which I was almost able to do before proving that those 42 hit points really did make a difference. But where the sickle works well is its heavy focus on ranged offense. The duo sickle throw serves as a great moment to get in, but it also makes it hard to deal with another enemy. And he has a damage buff that he applies to both the knights if you fail to keep the pressure on to the sickle version. It's not much, but it adds a little decision making onto what would otherwise be a fairly standard duo fight. Duo fights against smaller bosses can already make the game feel a bit bloated, but rematches with elite enemies that were promoted into bosses in the first place feels even more so. Again, the Cleanrot Knights will earn a degrade. There's some unique interaction with the arena and the two enemy types, but not enough to justify its own existence. This is the other fight that I forgot to press record on the attempt that I beat it on my main playthrough, so we're gonna get a little more footage of the Great Swordman here. Or we would if the footage didn't record with even more hideous pixelation because of some messed up settings on my part, so you'll mostly be watching my losing boss fight here. O'Neill is another boss that feels like an endgame encounter making an early appearance. Later on, another version of the commander will have his own arena, holding a key needed to access 2 optional remembrances. Making O'Neill an overworld boss focused on Scarlet Rot, rather than a restricted arena boss focused on Frostbite, completely changes the nature of the encounter. The later commander may feel like a weightier boss, but O'Neill feels significant without minimizing the impact of the later battle. The first difference is, of course, Torrent. Torrent isn't particularly helpful against the commander, since the long horizontal swings are pretty good at catching Torrent to do a little bit of damage and knock you off horseback. But the horseback does work great against the second difference between these variations, the types of mobs. When you find O'Neill, he immediately has 5 smaller enemies, some with crossbows, some with swords, and using Torrent to pick them off safely can work great, especially when you utilize the damage of a heavy weapon. The commander can buff the damage of all of his allies, which feels thematic and means that he won't be overlapping his attacks with the summons. Thanks, potato footage, get back in the pit now. The commander moveset is one of my favorite spear combat styles in a From Software game. Usually, a spear means that enemies will keep their distance, poking at you from safety, or backstepping away to create more. The commanders embrace melee with wide swings, slams, and this great little reverse stab with the bottom of the banner that I adore. The moveset here feels vast, and despite the wide variety of attacks, all the timing feels natural. O'Neill has one attack that inflicts rot, being a wind effect that the commanders can cancel after one swing, or continue to increase the size over time to a massive scale. It provides a unique threat compared to the later battle, and combines with Caelid's already astonishing atmosphere to produce something that feels enormous and unique to just this encounter. About halfway through the fight, O'Neill summons 3 heavy axe enemies, and that's the one place that this battle starts to lose me. The axe enemies do deal enough damage, especially when buffed, that they aren't something a player wants to try to contest, which usually leads to trying to avoid challenging them at all. Torrent works far less well against a few small targets, and overall, the wave of enemies feels unnecessary. There's one other big thing that makes O'Neill stand out from other Caelid bosses, namely that he has over 9,000 health. This beast has barely less health than Radahn. Elden Ring has a bad habit of bosses in the overworld feeling underwhelming as you explore, with only those nighttime bosses posing a more dangerous threat. O'Neill is a threatening, detailed opponent with high damage, multiple mobs, Scarlet Rot inflicting attacks, and the highest health pool so far in this Elden Ring analysis. It's phenomenal. Commander O'Neill earns an A grade. It is a ridiculously satisfying battle, and my favorite overworld fight in the game. The fact that this encounter feels different enough that it does not at all take away from the later battle in the same way the Ancestor Spirit does, also deserves serious accolades. Before I begin this next section, I am going to say some very, very minor DLC boss spoilers. There will be no footage or character names, but I did want to give people an opportunity to skip past this section. With that said, the boss that I saw the most defense for in the comments of the first video, to the point that I felt like I needed to put it into the second part, was the standard dragons, with a lot of recommendations being to fight them on foot or a hybrid of foot and horseback. I have been trying to fight the DLC dragons with a bit more of a mix, some on foot, some on hybrid, some completely on horse, and though I like some things about the different combat styles and dislike others, I'm not going to get into that yet because I haven't fought any of the base game dragons in this way. There are a surprising number of variations of movesets in the DLC dragons, so I'm not sure how much that'll also affect my opinion on it. When I do my next Elden Ring playthrough, which is going to happen again because I really like this game, I'll eventually try those base movesets again, but I still have over half the DLC left to play, and then I have a ton of other games I want to get through, so that's not going to be happening in time for this video to come out. Anyway, back to the already written review. As I mentioned in the battle with Smaragd, by the time you've reached the mid-game, the core moveset of the dragons have started to become pretty predictable, so variations in arena and moveset are the big thing that sets them apart. Decaying Ekzykes, who from now on I'm going to call Big E, has three major differences from that primary model. The first is in design. Big E's decaying look, his body torn and destroyed by the rot, looks incredible here. The second is that when Big E stomps, it leaves a scarlet rot cloud behind for a short time. Though this does make attacking the legs a little bit more difficult, it doesn't make it difficult enough to justify standing in front of him rather than behind him. The player just needs to head in the opposite direction of the stomp rather than pressing in towards it, and the risk is completely neutralized. What does still pose a risk wherever you're standing is the final adjustment. Big E's breath attack is a contender for the single most dangerous breath weapon among the dragons, which is saying a lot because almost all of them can one-shot you. Not only does it deal Scarlet Rot if you manage to survive, but the smoky nature of the breath means it's tough to tell if you've provoked a forward breath and are good to hammer away at him, or if he's about to create a cloud under him that will deal damage incredibly quickly. Even against the dragons I struggled with more, there isn't a breath weapon that I had a harder time dodging than this one. And a big part of that is because the breath doesn't always behave as a breath, and it doesn't always behave as a gas. Different attacks have different properties, and it's hard to tell them apart in the chaos. He's also the first dragon who presents the issue of him deciding he is too far away from his spawn point, leading to him teleporting away. Considering that was his spawn point, this feels a little wrong, but I've had Big E do this in multiple playthroughs, and I'm not sure what causes it. Thankfully, I was close enough that it didn't mean that the fight reset, which has happened to me on my first playthrough when he had less than 10% of his health, and was honestly way more frustrating than dying. Even with that strange teleportation, this is still a solid dragon encounter, earning another C grade. I think it lands between Smaragd and Egil. He brings much more interesting ideas than Smaragd, but he doesn't inspire the same wonder that Egil did. I'm of the opinion there is an almost universal Caelid experience that many players will go through. You find a chest in Limgrave, you open it, and then you're trapped in a mine. The enemies are all killing you in one shot and are pretty tanky themselves, but you start to learn the area and dodge around, eventually escaping, just to realize that you are definitely not in Limgrave. But something in the back of your mind wonders what's inside the dungeon, what's back there at the end running the mine. And when you open those doors, you're met with the Fallingstar beast. And the variety in this thing's moveset combined with the restrictive arena makes this fight absolutely terrifying to a new player. Though the 4,500 health is less than a lot of the Caelid fights, this fight is not designed for Caelid. This fight is designed to scare Limgrave players. Even before getting into magic and the beast's most dangerous moves, there is a huge variety here. Bites from the mandibles come out quickly with a long range, and the front and back stomps combine with long drags and a variety of tail swipes with a similarly large range and unnatural delays that make the core of the moveset tough to handle and understand. In particular, this backstep followed immediately by a rapid tail smash down that often leads to the beast charging forward is really threatening. Which brings me to what is probably the weakest aspect here, his charge. This is one of those attacks that, logically, in a vacuum it should be easy to dodge. Press roll when it runs past you. But the Fallingstar beast is channeling the worst parts of Ornstein with this charge. He rushes forward, spins in place, and repeats this a few times. Theoretically, you just dodge around it. But things get pretty weird pretty frequently. If you were too close to a wall and it hits you against it, the beast will, instead of turning around, just keep charging at that wall, and at that point, it's a 50-50 as to if he'll keep hitting you and kill you, or get lucky, like I was here. Sometimes you have to instantly dodge as soon as he pivots, and it does not feel good when you gamble wrong and lose all your progress. Beyond that, there are two magic attacks, an AoE, which doesn't do anything bad and looks pretty cool, and a walking homing attack that summons a danger zone you need to move out to 2 to 4 times, which works great for pressing back in towards the beast. It's hard to grade the beast. When the timing doesn't get too weird, it can work really well. It's a unique mobile design with a barrage of attacks in a tight area, but when the timing is off, it just feels wrong to fight. Look at this dodge. This dodge was done at the correct time. Even watching it, it feels like I did it wrong and just didn't take damage. On the other hand, it has a great placement within the world, but that placement doesn't really matter if it doesn't have the cleanness that fights like the Tree Sentinel did. Because of that, I can't give it above a D grade. I love the location, and I love finding this unique enemy as you're learning the scale of the game is so much larger than you thought, but it's not enough to make the fight fun. Another new foe, the first Magma Wyrm has one of the largest mine arenas, which is good because this thing is massive. And even with the limited moveset it uses here, it definitely needs the space. The Magma Wyrm's base design is mostly horizontal, which I think works really well with the camera. Unlike other huge bosses like the Dragonkin and the Tree Spirit, the variations in horizontal sword swings and bites versus vertical slams make the boss much easier to read than the other large bosses, and it means the camera also works much better. Like Quelaag, the Magma Wyrm uses attacks that leave magma to do a solid amount of damage. His first is a spit attack that goes behind him, substituting for the usual AoE as a much more dynamic get-off-me tool. He also has a long charge leaving a trail of lava behind him, but it doesn't cover enough area to really matter. The fact that he stops vomiting before he turns around does mean the chance of him standing in lava is significantly lower, but it also means that you can just run up to him and ignore the lava. The biggest problem here is universal to a lot of larger enemies, but is really felt by the Magma Wyrm. When you land a stagger and have the opportunity to move forward for a critical, high damage builds like this one can absolutely tear into him, making his unusually hefty 7100 health bar melt. In general, it's pretty easy to rack up damage on this guy, and his lack of mobility means that there's not really anything he can do about it. Magma Wyrms are also pretty straightforward enemies. Without the second phase to complicate the battle, nothing the worm does is ever particularly threatening or hard to read. A lot of times I see this boss pretty low on difficulty rankings, and though some later encounters add more challenge, this version doesn't have the damage to make this simple moveset feel threatening. With that being said, I think it still earns a C grade. Though a little on the easier side, it is still incredibly satisfying to shred this thing's health bar down, and the animations being so clean to read for a large enemy means dying isn't something you can blame on the game for this guy. Next on the list are the Nox Swordstress and Monk, another duo fight, but this time not against two bosses. It's against two mobs, and wow, these guys are fragile. With just 1,631 hit points each, these Nox make for an easier boss than if you were to take one of the crows from just outside and pop it in this arena, which is now the second Caelid boss easier than the mobs around it. I mean, the crows have somewhere around 3,000 hit points, so these two enemies combined are just barely more than a single elite mob. In terms of gameplay, they both look cool, I suppose. The Swordstress uses a sickle and has a pretty typical moveset, nothing special but nothing broken, and the Monk's chain mace does make for a fun whip-like weapon with a surprising range. But with that said, it also doesn't really stagger the player, which means you can just wail away on each of them. There's just not much to say here, because there's not much of a boss fight here. Low status resistances, low damage, and low health means by the time you're dealing with Caelid bosses with 7,000 to 9,000, they just don't put out the offense needed at this point in the game. I think the Nox earn a D grade. It's a dull fight, but it doesn't feel as insulting as the Misbegotten and Miranda Blossom. The movesets are at least detailed enough that if you were violently underleveled, they'd be a small threat, but it's still not much. The second Deathrite bird has one new move and another 1400 health, totaling to just under 8,000 hit points. In addition to the wide collection of spells the first bird brought to the table, this second variation now has a huge spear summoning attack reminiscent of Gale's lightning. It is more threatening, with the spears being more accurate, as the Deathrite bird doesn't overlap his next attack until after the spears have landed. Atmosphere and Arena is sadly where this bird lingers behind the first. The arena is covered with small slopes, roots, and mushrooms that the bird can get stuck on, or can make his attack hitboxes, especially if the flames, warp in weird and unique ways. The cliff above also creates one of the easiest boss cheeses in the game, as shooting this bird down from on high is a solution so simple you think it would fail by default. On top of that, Caelid actually looks less frightful at nighttime than it does during the day, as the bright red unnatural sky gives way to a much more tepid coloration. Because of this, the Deathrite bird doesn't pull off the same great look it did in Liurnia. I think this variation still earns a B grade, but it's further down the tier than the Liurnia version was. It just doesn't hit the same way here as it did in Liurnia, and that it will hit again in later areas. So, this is probably one of the bosses I forget exists the most. Every time I look at the boss list, I reach the Frenzied Duelist and say, wait, who was that? Have I fought that boss? And then I look at the footage, and I remember it's just the axe variation of the Grave Warden Duelist. The Frenzied Duelist can put out a serious offense, with long-range axe swings that have a lot of varied delays, meaning it's easy to be caught with a couple back-to-back hits that catch you off guard. On top of that, he's got a unique arena introduction, as you drop into his fight rather than walking into it. When I look at the moveset, I get pretty torn. There are some really cool moves happening here, particularly him using the ball and chain attached to his axe for a little extra range, or the huge axe spin attack that feels great to dodge through and around. But just as frequently, there's this grab that doesn't really go anywhere, and the delay on a lot of his axe swings means that some of the timing feels unnatural. On top of that, the Duelist only boasts 3,079 health, which means that it's pretty easy to melt him down. He has the damage to be a threat, but only if he's using his basic boring attacks, because every single one of his cool looking or fun to dodge moves aren't threatening enough to kill you in one hit and leave a huge window afterwards. It's a bit backwards, because if he's looking cool, you're in for an easy fight, but strange delays on the standard axe swings means that that's the more dangerous thing he can do. Combined with how short the fight is, it also means it's a strange fight for Caelid. There's nothing really Rot themed. If I showed you this footage completely separate from the context, this could feel like a boss in late Limgrave or the Peninsula. Because of this, I think the Frenzied Duelist only earns a D grade. Like the Nox before him, he doesn't provide enough of a memorable battle this late into the game. He is still a threat, but not in any way that feels satisfying. The Tree Spirit, who once appeared in Limgrave, has finally reappeared as a boss, and it is still an absolute truck for the level it appears. Knowing O'Neill and Radahn each boast around 9,000, what would you guess this variation of an enemy that appears very frequently in the overworld has in terms of health? If you guessed 18,144, please stop looking at the wiki, and join me in asking how this thing has double the health of Radahn. Now, Big E technically had more hit points with 23,000, but as an overworld dragon boss, they reliably have the most health. The increase with the Tree Spirit is to counter the same problem the Magma Wyrm had, where it's pretty easy to rack up damage, and it works decently well. Even with an absolutely massive health pool, the Tree Spirit here still went down in just under 3 minutes, which is not much time at all for how long that health bar initially seems. The Tree Spirit's damage is also significantly less able to one-shot the player at this point, and with many overworld variations starting to already appear, the chance a player will have already seen the base moveset before finding this means it's a lot harder to get to the Spirit underleveled. As per its name, the flames of the first Spirit have become poisoned by Rot. Unlike Big E, this change doesn't change the hitboxes or speed of the attacks, it just adds in the Scarlet Rot effect, which means there's no timings to unlearn as the player faces the Spirit, but also not anything to catch you off guard. It might seem a little high, but I think the Spirit just edges into C grade. The moveset may be simple to dodge, but the natural timing on a boss that is now much harder to plunge into severely underleveled means that the Putrid Tree Spirit is a satisfying boss to take down. Most of the duo fights that we've run into so far haven't been too challenging after the nerf, or at times, they've even felt too easy. And though it is frustrating to face bosses that feel too easy, it is better than the alternative of an over-tuned duo fight. Now, I was fortunate enough to have the damage to avoid the frustration this playthrough, but the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior duo fight that you find in Radahn's Palace, if the conditions to face Radahn have not been met, are one of the most brutal duo fights. The Misbegotten Warrior was an early game boss, although he's a simple enough boss for this point of the game, he's also aggressive and fast, making him a major threat in duo situations. And for some reason, they put him with a Crucible Knight that spawns in after enough damage is done to the Misbegotten. Their health totals here aren't too insane. The Misbegotten has almost doubled to 3,500, and the Crucible Knight boasts 4,500 health, though the Crucible Knight also has a shield making damage tough to deal, and with a full second phase with the tail attacks and flyby stabs. As a small detail, it turns out the Crucible Knight's tail can actually be jumped over, which can lead to an easy jump attack for some good punishing damage. The problem is that the best part of duo fights, like Ornstein and Smo, are gone, because there is a right way to deal with this fight. Kill the Misbegotten before you even touch the Crucible Knight. Having the Crucible Knight in the second phase while the warrior is still up is so much aggression that this is one of the fights that I found the most venom for online. On top of that, there's not any terrain here that you can use to space out opponents, like, as much as I hate to say it again, Ornstein and Smo's pillars. Here, the best bet is to sprint across the arena and fight the warrior for 5 to 10 seconds, while the Crucible Knight decides to walk rather than run over. The one thing they do have is that sleep pots can put them to sleep, which means it is possible to use farmable items to temporarily deactivate the bosses. Unfortunately, the Crucible Knight's resistance is enough that without some stats put in, it'll take a few pots to work, so it isn't as useful of a strategy as it becomes in the late game. The Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior are the first pure duo fight to earn an F grade in Elden Ring. Though there were foes that came before with an underwhelming battle, I prefer the underwhelming to the potentially infuriating. Now, though I loved Caelid as an area, I wasn't the biggest fan of a lot of his boss fights. There were a few gems in there, but the reliance on duo fights or rematches of foes that have overstayed their welcome means there's not really much I want to revisit on a future playthrough. For all of Caelid's boss struggles, however, the boss that awaits at the end is one of the game's best, Starscourge Radahn. Radahn doesn't have just a cutscene introducing him, he has an entire festival with a fully narrated cutscene explaining the gravity of who you're about to face. When you arrive in Redmane Castle after visiting the Altus Plateau at least once, the pavilion where you fought the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten has been cleared out and filled with NPCs that the player may or may not have encountered on their journey thus far. This is the Radahn Festival, a celebration of war where warriors have come together to free Radahn from his madness and claim his great rune. Teleporting to the massive battlefield, the spectacle of this encounter is unlike anything else up to this point. This arena is beyond massive, and somehow, it all gets used. Torrent even serves an important mobility role. Without him, traveling the arena or escaping later actions can take ages. Radahn starts with a bow that serves as his secondary weapon if the player ever runs too far away, and he has 3 attacks here. The first is a single purple bolt that moves quickly but has a regular rhythm that can be learned. On top of that, piles of weapons left from the people who tried and failed to face Radahn serve as cover. It's not an attack that can be dodged on Torrent, even with a sprint, but the cover works, meaning the player is given the choice of a longer run without the horse to get to a closer ranged moveset, or to use more restrictive cover to press forward. The close ranged bow attacks, meanwhile, focus on making closing that final distance more exciting. A volley of arrows to the sky serves as a much better balanced version of Aldrich's arrows, since this one doesn't overlap with his other attacks and isn't used as a get-off-me tool, but instead a pressure tool as you move in. The shotgun burst of arrows is a little bit weaker, as he can pull it out when there isn't enough space to get the horizontal movement needed to effectively dodge it. But when you are at the right distance, it feels really good to strafe around on Torrent. On top of that, the entire run towards Radahn also provides the opportunity to summon in your forces, a mechanic I don't display here as I had challenged myself to use no summons after using Spirit Ashes pretty reliably my first playthrough. I want to specify, this is not because using Spirit Ashes or summons are bad or invalidates anything. This is fully personal taste because you get a better idea of the full depth of the moveset without the summons. All the signs on the ground summon NPCs from the festival. Blade, Alexander, Tragoth, Okina, Lionel, Faralina, Jaren, and of course, Patches. All of them are summoned in to a maximum of 3 summons at a time to help you deal with Radahn. The exception here is Patches, who will see Radahn, realize this is not worth it, and immediately leave the fight to never return. Radahn's melee moveset may look strange fighting him one-on-one, but that's because this boss, like Lud and Zalin and the Afflicted Grave Robbers, is designed to be fought as a raid boss. Unlike those bosses that use numbers to balance it out, which could make them frustrating on a solo challenge, Radahn is built from the ground up around fighting multiple players at once. He uses long horizontal sweeps and slams as he flies around the arena on Leonard, the most badass horse in Elden Ring, sorry Torrent. With his unique timing and aiming, the moveset may look strange, but when he attacks a group around him, the wide nature of the spins and combos creates the feeling that this is a man that cannot be stopped alone. The NPC summons are each designed to die and be resummoned up to 3 times throughout the fight, until eventually Radahn has torn his way through each and every one of them, and at that point, it becomes left as the player and Radahn for their final duel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, Radahn leaves the fight. His music stops completely, and he's just out of the arena. There's no sight of him. It turns from nighttime to daytime, and then, like a meteor, he smashes back into the ground, dealing enough damage to one-shot almost any properly leveled build here. Frustratingly, the NPCs will see Radahn's location as where he's going to land, which means any NPCs alive here are going to die as soon as the phase starts. Alexander is even hard-coded to die and stop being available for the second phase, as that ends up being a key piece of his NPC questline. The fact that you could live through the questline with Alexander made his quest one of the best questlines From Software has ever done. The second phase puts much more of an emphasis on gravity magic. Radahn will force a reposition of the player, create huge AoEs at the end of his swords, summon meteors that rush down players, and create storms of tracking black orbs. Compared to the Onyx Lord's small gravity magic variations that lacked any real threat, these spells look and feel incredible. The scale here remains massive, and it makes the phase escalation feel amazing. The purple lights become a focus right as the arena light shifts to make that purple pop against the blue sky, and the color design looks gorgeous. The evolution of color also evolves on all of Caelid. It makes the fight feel like a culmination of everything that came before, pushing its identity even further. With that said, I have 2 big peeves I have to hit. First, whenever he buffs his weapons or prepares a huge AoE, he raises the sword into the air and screams. Now, I might be missing a tell here, but it feels like there isn't a difference between an attack that serves as the window to attack him versus an attack where you need to be getting out of the way now. The music is also a little underwhelming. It's not bad or obnoxious by any means, but in a series with so many spectacular songs, it feels almost like background music compared to the chaos of Godefroy the Grafted or the beauty of Renala's theme. If I played this music under another boss, it would still fit. And to prove it, I had been playing Radahn's theme under O'Neill's section rather than the generic boss theme. If you did notice, kudos to you, but the fact that many people likely didn't kind of proves that though it's not bad, it's not as good as I feel it could be. And sadly, that is where I stand on a lot of it at the end. I know I've been gushing a lot about the fight, and that's because it does some incredible things that nothing else in the library has done. But for the creative animations and designs, other animations will linger in strange ways as attacks come out with the bizarre delays, and Radahn's strangely shaped hurtbox means you have to really press yourself against him to deal damage. And by the end of the fight, as he floats off the horse, it can feel off as you press in to deal damage. And though summoning isn't great, having to resummon after most of the NPCs decided to stand and wait and die after the second phase took time away from the fight. For a while, I debated between an A or S grade for Radahn. There were a lot of small errors that the player does feel as they play through this fight, but even with those errors, even if I can point out things that I may find frustrating, the creativity and visual execution here is contagious to the point that I can't not give him an S grade. He's also one of the most difficult bosses to talk about the difficulty of. I fought Radahn on release when a single hit could mean death to a heavy armor build, but after community outcry, he was nerfed hard. Now there were some nerfs or balance patches after release that I believe were needed, but I don't think Radahn was actually among them. As an optional mid-game fight, it meant that players could come back over-leveled if the battle was ever too much and experience the fight at a power level I fought it at about now. But with the new patch bringing a properly leveled player to the power level seen in the footage, it means that to get that same experience of fighting an unstoppable Radahn, the player needs to go out of the way to do so before doing anything else. Now, endgame bosses that are overtuned might need nerfs, but his position in the mid-game can justify higher numbers, because those numbers never go past where the player can realistically grow. So when I did this run, I did the Magma Wyrm Makar at the end of Liurnia instead of at the start of Altus Plateau, before I realized that, if I moved more forward, Radahn would spawn and I wouldn't be able to fight the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten before fighting Radahn. With that said, this named Magma Wyrm is designed to be fought at about the same time as the variation in Caelid, as the damage of his moves and hit points are exactly the same. That's right, we've got the most distant twins thus far, each coming in with 7,141 hit points. There are two big differences. The first and most immediately obvious is the arena and world placement. The first Magma Wyrm dropped a sword and rested in a circular room, completely optional. Makar, meanwhile, is one of the two potential ways to climb into the Altus Plateau, and even has his own unique arena. Built around a huge center structure, the arena is larger and actually has more places to hide, which makes Makar's lava even less threatening on its own, and more importantly, makes sure there's space for Makar to show off his new second phase. The Magma Wyrm had a sword, and he did use it for long-ranged attacks and slams. But after dropping under half health, Makar lights his sword on fire, then stands up on his hind legs and starts fighting as a duelist. It's a very Ludwig-inspired second phase, and though it doesn't reach the emotional highs Ludwig did, I like the moveset evolution a lot. The huge spins are delayed but easy to read, and stepping forward while belching lava continues that same focus on positioning the fight is built around, while the new fire effects on the slam make the phases feel distinct while keeping the feeling of the Magma Wyrm the same throughout the fight. I think the Magma Wyrm Makar is a solid step around the Magma Wyrm proper, earning a high B grade. He's a solid, memorable encounter that works as one of the potential threats to overcome in order to access the Altus Plateau that the middle area of the game builds up to. That said, whether he's meant to be fought at the end of Liurnia or the start of Altus Plateau, I'll leave up to you. Obviously, I fought him at the end of Liurnia here, but if I were to fight him at the start of the Altus Plateau, he'd probably feel a little under-leveled compared to everything I just did in Caelid. And of all the bosses I expected to get an overworld variation, the Black Knife Assassin was not on the shortlist. But the fight with the assassin on the steps of the Sainted Hero's grave is another excellent showcase. Though it lacks both the direct atmosphere of the other assassins up to this point and the restrictive space putting an emphasis on the assassin's threat, it works pretty well as a guard dog enemy as well. The only new addition to the moveset here is a tall leap attack, mainly designed to punish a player using Torrent against her. Beyond that, the quick movements do a great job at following the player. And though the atmosphere may not be as uncanny in the bright light of the Altus Plateau, the assassin sticks out against the bright gold in a way that feels more intentionally out of place. And a boss at the entrance to a dungeon rather than the end is still a fun twist, keeping with the Black Knife Assassin's themes of being unorthodox encounters. This is also the tankiest of the four basic Black Knife Assassins at 5,412 health, which may be lower than most overworld bosses, but the dodgy nature of the fight makes it go a long way. I think the Black Knife Assassin here earns another B grade. Again, every version of the Black Knife Assassin makes the enemy shine, even if this version is a little weaker than the others. And finally, returning as a boss proper, the ancient hero of Zamor stands as the boss that the Black Knife Assassin was blocking off, and though she works decently well, she's less suited to this arena than she was to the Everjail. Increasing by about 1,300 health to a total of 3,811, she's still more fragile than you'd hope. After all, the boss directly before her, who also put a strong emphasis on being dodgy, has almost 1,600 more health, which just makes this health value feel strangely low. On top of that, the purple hue of the Everjail actually added a lot to the atmosphere of the enemy. Within the catacombs, it looks a lot more generic. On top of that, the larger arena means that the AoEs common in the second phase become a lot easier to avoid. The damage is scaled a little, but it doesn't distinguish itself from the Everjail variation in any way. If anything, it's an easier battle here due to an increased arena size. I think this Ancient Hero of Zamor earns a high C grade. Though it lingers behind the other variation, it's not a bad fight. It just lacks a lot of the punch the Everjail was able to deliver. The Black Knife Assassin in the Sage's Cave is a divisive encounter, namely because, now that you have a familiarity with the enemy, they've made it invisible. That said, there were accommodations made regarding the assassin's new status. The health is lower here than just a few fights ago, resting just under 4,000 health. On top of that, the assassin's arena is almost entirely covered in water, and the player can watch for movement in the water to try to track the assassin down. Of course, how easy that is depends on a lot of factors. Greatswords with a horizontal swing will work a lot better than katanas designed to press against an enemy, especially when the assassin has a preference to leaping behind the player to get into a grab. On top of that, as the player will panic and attack, they make their own ripples, meaning the more you're moving, the harder it is to track the assassin down. Alternatively, the battle does give you the option to give up your offhand to see the assassin by wielding the sentry torch. Of course, if you do this, the assassin's aggression amps back up to full speed, and she regains her destined death moves, so it becomes a far more standard encounter, with a bit of a handicap stopping you from using shields or dual wielding. I think this is a great side boss. It's got a way around the invisibility mechanic if it becomes too frustrating, but it's also a gimmick that isn't too unfair on its own. Because of that, I think it earns another B grade, and it's probably my favorite of the 4 assassins thus far. It also drops an item that makes you better at stealth, and though it's a small detail, I really enjoy when a fight builds directly into what it gives you. It makes the talisman feel real. This Knight's Cavalry is the last one until we jump up to endgame or near endgame stats, and it is still definitely struggling to remain relevant as an exciting nighttime boss event. And still struggling to deal with knee-high walls, but that's not unique to this one. Despite higher damage and a small health increase, the Knight's Cavalry just has not changed at all. This is the 6th one in the game, with the only difference being in the weapons. On top of that, the change to health is really minimal. This cavalry only has 3,700 health. The next time we see them, they'll finally get that huge boost to durability, but this version just doesn't have the heft necessary for this point in the game, especially since, once that horse is down, you get so much free time to deal damage to the cavalry directly. As you can probably see by this footage, this is one of the laziest fights I performed in the entire game. I jumped into almost every single attack and failed to dodge almost every piece of offense put out, but I still ended the fight with over half my healing flasks left. Considering that the cavalry is supposed to be one of those things making the knight seem terrifying, that just is not here. This knight's cavalry is finally dipped down into the D grade. This is the last time we'll see them in this part, but we'll certainly be seeing them again in part 3. The Tibia Mariner is back again, and what the hell is that? That's right, the Tibia Mariner is not only back in another atmospheric ruin, but it has a few new tricks on top of the improved skeletons. When at a distance, the Mariner summons a giant skeleton to do a single massive laser beam that does a ton of damage. Unfortunately, the best way to dodge the attack is to rush towards the skeleton to get the Mariner before the attack launches, which means you're back by the Mariner at the end. With that said, it does add an inch of the needed spectacle to the Mariner fight, meaning this version earns another high D grade. Though it doesn't fix the issues within the skeleton of the fight, pun intended, it's enough to make the Mariner rematch in the Plateau not feel like a wasted battle in the same way the Liurnia variation was. And back for his final match, it is one of our first foes, the Erdtree Burial Watchdog. Wielding a sword again, and with only a single head, the Watchdog's big variation here is electric bolts rather than a fire breath, which is a neat change that doesn't change the fight too significantly. The health is still incredibly low here at 3,419, which means it's not nearly as much of a challenge as many of the other foes within the plateau, which seems to be a theme with a lot of these boss fights. In the moment, the Watchdog won't feel significant. After all, in Caelid, you fought 2 varied Watchdogs at once, so much so that even with the higher base damage, it's not enough to make this Watchdog uniquely tough. In the moment, the Watchdog doesn't feel significant. After all, in Caelid, you fought 2 varied Watchdogs at once, so even with much higher base damage, it's not enough to make this Watchdog uniquely difficult. After this, though, all 3 Watchdogs will start to appear all over the lands between as standard enemies. So this ends up being a bit of a farewell round for the boss. Though again, it doesn't make it feel better in the moment, having all the Watchdogs introduced in boss fights does mean that they never feel too intimidating as you find them within the late game catacombs and dungeons. This final Erdtree Burial Watchdog earns a C grade. It's a decent fight that isn't frustrating but isn't incredible. And though part of that may be rose-tinted glasses and my love for this animation set, I think they served their decent role as early to overcome early game bosses. In Limgrave, when we encountered the Stone Digger Troll, I gave it a lot more credit than it might have deserved, because I think it works pretty well as a tutorial boss for the mines. The Altus Plateau, meanwhile, is about the halfway point of the game proper. We are 85 bosses into this series, and after all of that, the Stone Digger Troll somehow comes back in a room filled with explosive barrels for some reason. The moveset, however, is not able to persevere into the mid-game. At this point, players will know all about jump attacks, shield guards, and arts of war that can tear through their attacks, so this troll serves no real educational role. And without the characterization of bowls, this fight ends up becoming another underwhelming one. The fire barrels feel like they're here for some reason, Maybe with Pyromancy it's possible to lure the troll into oil and then light him ablaze for some huge damage. The issue is that taking him out is so easy that there's no reason to use that unique environment, which makes for a disappointing ending. Not being granted any of the kindness the first version did, the Stone Digger Troll is a low D-grade boss fight. There's no place that Elden Ring struggles more with mini-bosses and making them feel worthwhile than in the mid-game. The Crystalians showing within the Altus Tunnel is a bit of a downgrade from the Caelid variation, and the fight offers just more of the same. The Spear version continues to bring his A-game in aggression, but this time it's the Ringblade version spinning in place in the background while he watches his companion be massacred. At this point, I don't have much else to say I haven't said already. It's another D-grade variation for one of the most bizarrely simple duel fights in the series. Returning from Caelid, the Fallingstar beast in the Altus Plateau shows how much better the enemy works in the overworld. The health increases a ton between the two encounters, with the health pool rising from the 4,500 to 7,000, and it makes the Fallingstar beast really feel like it's made out of stone now that it can take some hits. On top of that, the moveset works better outside. With no walls to get caught on, the charge timing actually works well. The roll timing can be a little bit weird, as it can with all of its melee attacks, but compared to the delays on the turnaround the restricted area had imposed on the beast, this is a huge improvement. And though the beast may look more out of place on the plateau than in a mine, the wordless storytelling demonstrates that the name of the Fallingstar beast is not metaphorical, as the player finds him this time in a huge crater glowing with the same energy that the Fallingstar beast uses for his magical assaults. Though it may lack the cruelty the first beast provided new players brave enough to face the dungeon they were trapped in, this one just does everything else really smoothly. With another large jump, I think this beast earns a B grade. The outdoor arena fixed a ton of the timing and collision problems, leaving a fight that feels mobile with fun, wordless storytelling to make the region feel more unique. Both returning in another match, the Omen Killer has joined with Miranda, the Blighted Bloom. Omen Killer's arena is much smaller here, but Miranda's stationary threat is a lot less of a hindrance than the dogs once were. This footage also reveals that I recorded this before 1.08, because Miranda the Blighted Bloom has since been demoted to Miranda Flower. The arena is significantly larger than it was in the first battle with the Miranda Flower, and just like then, so long as at least some of the arena is safe, the Flower poses no threat. Let the Omen Killer come to you, and then it's just a one-on-one fight, followed by beating up the uniquely named Flower. Or not so uniquely named Flower if you're playing after the patch. The first issue here is that Omen Killer's stats have not increased at all. He was already an intentionally fragile boss in Liurnia, but in the Altus Plateau, his 2,306 hit points are gone in a flash. He may try to linger near the bloom at first, but as soon as he's left the bloom's radius of effect, the fight is all but over. The bloom's attacks last much longer in this variation, but all that does is make you wait longer. Really riveting gameplay happening here. I feel like, if given a Lothric and Lorien gimmick, this fight had some potential. Imagine if the Omen Killer was able to be continuously revived with all or most of its health if the bloom is still alive. That means that killing Omen Killer, only to be met with longer than usual area attacks, provides an actual threat, and choosing to focus on dodging while waiting for an opportunity to go for the real boss would add a lot of depth to it. But we don't have that, so instead we're left with two bosses with not enough health, damage, or aggression to pose a threat. Omen Killer and the Miranda Flower earn a low D grade. I still like fighting the Omen Killer, which saves it from the F grade, but the fight isn't great. After all, after Omen Killer is gone, it's just a matter of pressing your attack button of choice. So, when I said the Cleanrot Knight was the last mob introduced via a boss fight, I was wrong in the first video. Not only did Battlemage Hughes introduce the Battle Mages earlier, but we also have the Sanguine Noble, who I also genuinely forgot about the existence of, because fighting him properly leveled looks like this. The Sanguine Noble has some theoretically interesting attacks. It uses blood puddles to train you for the Moog fight in the late game, dealing bleed damage whenever you stand in them, has a parry, and some fast dagger throws and leaps. But that doesn't really matter when you have 3,100 health. Now, I complained that bosses around 4,000 hit points feel fragile here, so just like a lot of these other strange mid-game fights, it doesn't stick around long enough to make an impact. I'm of the opinion that the worst part of Elden Ring is the mid-game. The early game side bosses feel more exciting to find as you start to put your build together, and the end game lowers the boss count to make less bosses that pose more of a challenge. In the mid-game though, it rests in this strange point where some bosses assume you have a complete build and can face battles with over 10,000 health, and others are dead in less than a minute. This is the area building towards the capital, the thing that everything in the first two parts of this series lead to, and it just gives us fights like this that don't leave any impact. I think the Sanguine Noble earns an F grade. This is too late to be introducing a mob, and the Noble doesn't have enough health necessary to teach the moveset lessons that it could be preparing the player for. As I mentioned, I loved the fight with Godefroy the Grafted. It felt like an exciting early game climax, had an excellent score and phase transition, and also used his moveset to encourage creative use of Elden Ring's many defensive options in a fun and engaging way. He felt so wholly unique in the world that they decided to take his first phase and put it in a mid-game Everjail, and also take away his music. This is Godefroy the Grafted, and he is Godric at home, and even that makes him sound better than he is. He may have double Godric's health, but after just short of 70 other boss fights, I'd sure hope he has double his health, because everything else feels worse. The atmosphere built by Stormveil Castle made Godric feel spectacular and horrifying, even though he lingers behind the other remembrances in terms of scale. In the Everjail, with generic eerie music and a blue hue covering the fleshy colors of Godefroy's potential palette, all of that is gone. The huge moves around the arena also feel a lot more restricted in the smaller Everjail space. On top of that, you already know the entire moveset, which is why they keep it to the easier to dodge first phase versions. Except of course the triple ground slam, which becomes much more frustrating to time correctly when you can't hear Godric's cries of effort. This entire fight starts to feel so quiet and static in comparison. Godric felt like a raging abomination who wanted you dead, but with the voice lines and evolution cut out of the fight, it feels dry, clinical, and like nothing. One criticism levied to Elden Ring is that almost every boss appears somewhere else in the game. With Godefroy, every single boss in Limgrave is reused. There is not a single boss you cannot find somewhere else, and that is really sad. Liurnia has Rennala, Caelid has Radahn, Mount Gelmir has Rykard, and the use of Morgoth at the end of the capital feels natural. But why did you have to take this from Godric? Why can't he just be the early remembrance fight rather than be dropped in here to fill a space that didn't even need to be filled? In terms of gameplay, Godefroy would earn a high C, maybe even a B grade, but this enemy reuse is more than just sloppy. It is one of the few bosses in this game that makes me genuinely upset. People would be just as impressed with 163 boss counters. We did not need this. I'm going to put him in the F grade, and though that might be lower than he deserves mechanically, I will never have the desire to go and do this fight again unless I absolutely cannot operate without his dropped item. We're about to get to the good bosses of the Altus Plateau, but before that we have another contender for the shortest battle in this entire series. Necromancer Garris is a man with a mace and one of those skull snail things that can shoot a projectile or roll at you. He can cast one spell with a slow startup that shoots homing projectiles, but this is an NPC fight with a health bar. He's only got 3,200 hit points, again, and like all the other Altus Plateau bosses with that amount, the player can almost effortlessly outlast him. The snail doesn't even start aggressive to the player, and by the time it's awake, it'll maybe have the chance to attack twice, and even if you have low damage, it's got somewhere less than 614 health, as shown by the fact that I one-shot it after this fight was done. We're finally out of the boring section of the plateau now with that, but we have this one final F grade, before things turn around in a big way with one of the fights that still scares me the most in the whole game. The Tree Sentinel may be the first overworld challenge designed to reward players to come back and face him once they've grown in power, but the second appearance of the boss, excluding of course Royal Knight Loretta, is a duo fight that sits in a pretty strange place. Like the first Tree Sentinel, the double Sentinel battle is placed in such a way that a normal playthrough will have to run through the area. But like the Tree Sentinel, they aren't required, and there's a site of grace directly behind them. If both are fought at once, it becomes a wild battle, to put it mildly. The Tree Sentinels here are just as aggressive, and though their health is just over doubled from the 2,900 health of the Limgrave variant, coming in at 6,400 and 5,300 each, the damage is scaled enough that these versions are each a serious threat to the player on their own. Fighting the Sentinels at once has never felt great to me, but with the grace behind them, the fight can become somewhat of a stealth challenge. If you stay close to the wall and fight one of the sentinels, the others won't notice you unless you drift too far towards it. However, it also means the huge staircase doesn't get used, and the impressive mobility of the sentinel ends up going underutilized. So, end of the day, I can't really say how intentional or unintentional it is. It's certainly a more enjoyable fight than dealing with two at once, as the challenge then evolves into having to beat two in a row. After all, once one is dead, you don't get your reward, and that one will come back unless you face down whichever one you didn't beat. What I can comment on, though, is the fact that swapping to the torch instead of the shield does a lot to keep this fight from falling into some frustrating traps. From a mechanical standpoint, it keeps the fights from feeling too similar, and the Sentinel can still put out a solid offense even with a simpler array of attacks. What it also does is it means that magic users will have an easier time with the second one, and that when fighting two at once, the one with less health has less moments where you aren't able to hit him, and less delayed attacks to stack with the main sentinels. The choice between facing them as you ascend or looping back around means that these sentinels fulfill a variation of the first's role. Instead of asking you to mechanically improve before returning, it asks you to find another way to approach it before racing full force at them. I think the tree sentinel reappearing in the plateau is also important, considering one of the required bosses in the royal capital is a variation of it. Providing you an optional reminder of the enemy that's a little better level does a great job building to that otherwise unexpected fight. I think the double tree sentinels earn a C grade. It's a fun enough battle, and though it doesn't feel as solid a role as the first sentinel and the duo fight holds the template back, it's still exciting enough to stay in that average grade. This one's going to be a bit of a preview for what will no doubt be one of my hottest takes in the Elden Ring series, but I really love the Godskin enemies, and this first introduction to the Apostle in the Windmill Village was one of the highlights for my first Elden Ring playthrough. The village is a great zone, using the bright yellows of the plateau to reveal a town filled with women singing and dancing while holding their knives makes the player feel immediately unsettled and makes the area stand out. And when you reach the top of the village, to see this stark white figure emerge using black flame and to hear that theme, the level of malice this thing exudes is fantastic. And I honestly cannot go further without mentioning that theme. The Godskin theme is one of the best pieces of music in Elden Ring. The boss themes in Elden Ring are often one of the few things I found myself disappointed by. Many of them lack a real presence, which means that the power of a boss fight appearing lacks the same punch it did in games like Bloodborne, where even the unique Chalice theme really hit hard. And I know analytically, Elden Ring uses more ambient music, which means it's always going to be harder to get boss music to stand out. It's not trying the same thing as Dark Souls or Bloodborne. But when I hear themes like this, it reminds me of how much presence just the music alone can provide a boss battle. The Apostle is dangerous, and it uses the area, design, music, and moveset to convey that all within seconds. The Apostle is a mostly melee enemy using long combos and spins with his glaive, sickle, I'm not sure quite what to call the hook. The movements are as fluid as you expect, and combos are usually well punctuated with a heavy lean or slam, making it clear when the barrage of attacks is ended. On top of that, he can throw a black flame, which he loves to do when players heal from a neutral place. And though I've certainly been caught with plenty of hits, if you have enough space, you can usually still roll out of the way of it. And the committed nature of his moveset means there are plenty of opportunities to heal even beyond that. He's also one of the first overworld bosses to use a second phase, empowering himself with Black Flame and taking the concept of using his lankiness for range to an extreme. He has multiple attacks that now create huge AoEs around himself, attacks that'll reach forward and he'll pull the rest of his body to him, or an evolution of his spin that comes back down towards him as the move progresses, which is a fun twist on him pushing out with the spin. I love the AoE nature of so much of his second phase moveset here, because it takes the solid melee moveset and makes it feel complete by covering the ranged weaknesses the Apostle has in his first phase. The moveset doesn't have any tricks or anything absurd or hard to teach. Things come out with time to react, and the faster moves deal low enough amounts of damage that it never feels unbeatable or unfair. With around 7,500 health, the Apostle also has enough health to matter without seeming unbeatable, making it provide a solid mid-game challenge that teaches the player this absolutely critical enemy. The Godskin Apostle earns an A grade. I've heard a lot of dislike for the Godskin, but this is one of the best overworld encounters for me. Even the area it's fought in provides just enough space to let the moveset shine, which is something that overworld areas have a hard time restricting. The sole boss encounter against Wyrmface is an excellent proof of what makes the enemy work in its smaller versions, even if it struggles from its enormous scale, often making it hard to read. When you head towards the Erdtree in the plateau, instead of an Erdtree avatar or tree spirit, the player is instead met with a much deeper corruption. The tree is black and twisted, as no light can press into this shade, and at the base of the tree is this figure, hunched over, almost looking like it's crying. And as you get closer, it stands up and begins to vomit black ichor, spit clouds of death, and smash its face into the other trees in the area, destroying everything. Despite sitting at a lower 5800 health and being fairly easy to hit, the Wyrmface's primary threat doesn't come from the damage it deals or trying to outlast your flask, but via death. When your death bar fills, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. Don't let the death bar fill up. And with clouds of smoke and almost every attack inflicting death, the passivity of the Wyrmface ends up being intimidating if you don't know the tells to every attack. Especially with so much of the body being off-screen due to the boss's scale, grabs and head slams can come out of seemingly nowhere, meaning he's great at making the player feel uncomfortable. The arena, however, is what loses a lot of the boss's gusto. With a ton of small drops, it's pretty easy for the Wyrmface to slip and land in a different area, usually filled with small enemies the player will need to worry about. Especially if Wyrmface ends up on these strange slopes and formations, the fact that the Wyrmface doesn't move with speed or intent can make the fight lose its tempo. Even with that, it is a fun inversion from the pattern that the Erdtree avatars have established. After all, in Caelid, the avatar remained even after the rot had taken over, but here, the death is so deep and unfeeling that even the tree itself has been corrupted. It creates a really memorable atmosphere, even if a simple moveset and messy arena mean the boss struggles to be a fun fight once you learn how to avoid the death mechanic. I think Wyrmface still earns a low B grade. The atmosphere here, as you start to learn of the underbelly and dangers lurking deeper in the capital, is great, and the Wyrmface ends up a memorable battle. Though Agheel introduces dragons to the player, Lansseax elevates the spectacle of dragons even higher, showing the scale that Elden Ring plans to reach with these beasts in its late game. Lansseax has a deep and detailed moveset full of spells, melee attacks, unique stomps, and fire breath, and she is gone. That's right, Lansseax ambushes the player right at the start of the plateau, and once she realizes they pose a threat, she retreats back to be found later. I love this type of introduction, and the scale of Lansseax fits the template really well. She may lack the bulk of the earlier dragons, sitting with only 9,000 hit points compared to Big E's 21,000, but a far more threatening moveset and higher defensive stats means that Lansseax manages to feel more spectacular and more threatening than the theoretically more statistically dangerous foes. Lansseax's attacks have a ton of character, making her seem almost feral. Claw swipes will carry her forward or smash into the ground full force, with red lightning accenting every single movement she makes. A spinning electric backhand feels so much better than the tail whip, and though there are less fire breaths, the one that exist are much easier to read and can be dodged on horseback or on foot, meaning both playstyles work really well. And of course, that sword summoning attack is iconic, standing on her hind legs and creating this huge sword out of electricity to rush towards the player looks and feels amazing. And though it's threatening, it's also easy enough to dodge to not feel unfair. With that said, the electric after effects on some claw swipes don't feel quite as good. On some times, it feels like a lingering hitbox, which is fine, but some of the claw strikes have a very small bolt hit right where the claw impacted, which can lead to some strange moments that feel like double hits. On top of that, this triple wing beat that knocks the player off balance feels bizarre. It doesn't lead to or combo into anything, and it doesn't do damage, it just staggers the player a few times. If someone can tell me what they think this attack is supposed to do, I'd be interested to hear. Also, I wish the arena was just a little bit bigger. Dragons move a lot, which is fine, but Lansseax has the smallest arena so far of the dragons, and it's pretty easy to end up at the edges of the bluff where you finally face Lansseax, which can lead to strange drops or Lansseax models standing at strange angles. Even with those minuses, the Ancient Dragon Lansseax earns a B grade and is my favorite dragon fight in Elden Ring so far. And wrapping up the first half of the plateau before we head to Nokron and Mount Gelmir is Elmer of the Briar, the full version of the Bell-Bearing Hunter. Well, I say full version, but there really isn't anything that makes Elmer unique from the Hunter outside of a more intentional arena and having a name. On top of that, there are bell-bearing hunters that come after when you'd want to fight Elmer. Of the 5 variations of this boss, Elmer sits right in the middle. 2 hunters are weaker than him, 2 are stronger. It makes his placement as the true version of the fight feel unusual, because he doesn't really feel like a culmination of the enemy type, just one of the easier ones to find if you aren't traveling at nighttime. The arena is one of the most unique ones in Elden Ring. It begins as a thin path, but any rolling or attacks from the player or boss will break the furniture, slowly opening the space up as the fight progresses. On a bit of a backwards point, however, Elemer is actually easier in tight spaces. His most dangerous attacks are his mid to far ranged swings, which he only does at a distance. On top of that, and this may sound strange, but Elemer of the Briar is properly scaled for the area he's in. The Bell-bearing hunters are all scaled to be more powerful than the rest of their area. With 4,900 health, that's not even 1,000 more than the Bell-bearing hunter we encountered in Liurnia, and Caelid, the Plateau, and Mount Gelmir all land around the same level range, which means it's incredibly easy to overlevel this true encounter. With all that said and done, I still love the enemy template, and Elemer of the Briar still deserves a high B grade. I still think it works better in the overworld as a hunter, but this is a fun arena that makes for an engaging battle. Just one eclipsed by the nighttime variations. The Mimic tier is one of Elden Ring's really experimental encounters, and I adore it for that. When the player enters the arena, the Mimic tier takes form as the player, being able to make use of their weapons, their spells, their ashes of war, and even their equipped consumable items, from limited flasks to anything else the player has equipped. Strangely enough, this is also one of the only bosses that I can't find an accurate health for. The wiki just says around 19,000, but that sounds more like the later variation. The Mimic's tier health seems decent enough, nothing insanely high or durable, but high enough that it'll still beat the player in a slugfest. I'm curious if the player's health and mana actually affect the stats of the tier. I can't find anything one way or the other, and I usually level Vigor pretty regularly in all my builds, so I haven't seen any real variation. With that said, the Mimic tier is not that hard to get the upper hand on. All of the moves will naturally be familiar to you, and though the player's range will always be identical to the tier, the fact that you can predict and exploit the moveset you know means that the Mimic tier isn't too overly threatening, especially compared to some of the other foes, even among NPCs. Even more so, considering that the Mimic tier has my favorite cheese in the entire series, the only cheese I would ever recommend anyone do. Take off all your gear, walk in, and let it spawn. Then, put your gear back on and profit as you beat the hell out of a naked version of yourself. It is hilarious and hilariously easy. Outside of a few remembrance bosses, a lot of the encounters in Elden Ring are pretty safe. Mobs or enemies, with a handful of bosses that are reused intermittently throughout the game. Though the Mimic tier may be easy, it is such a creative and fun idea that I love it despite the lack of challenge. I love weird and unique designs, and the fact that Mimic tier will change into a wizard and occasionally bonk you with your own staff is incredible. The Mimic tier earns a B grade. He's probably the easiest grade enemy in the game, but I love that pile of goo. As I mentioned in the Ancestor Spirit, the fact that the first spirit exists takes a decent amount away from the regal Ancestor Spirit, and especially considering how close together the two fights are, it's a shame, since the regal Ancestor Spirit uses so many of the same tricks. You enter the fight the same way, get that same first gorgeous shot, and most of the moveset is identical, outside of a few new moves. The health increase is also pretty small, rising only from 4,300 to 6,100. I suppose the regal Ancestor Spirit does have a little more bulk than that, since it has a way to heal, but there's no confirmation that the spirit will even go for the healing move before the battle is done. Outside of the standard moveset, the regal Ancestor Spirit has a few new magically inclined moves. First, the arena this time is filled with spectral animals, and at any point, the spirit can collapse and reappear out of one of the other animals in the arena. It's a neat move, but it doesn't really do much of anything, especially since the spirit would often use this move with no real prompting, it just changes location. The same animals are also the key to its healing method. The spirit can channel the animals around it, consuming them to heal itself incredibly quickly. The player has an opportunity to deal a little damage here, but unlike Amelia and Bloodborne, the heal is fast enough that a properly leveled player isn't going to be out-damaging it. Past that, there's a new charging attack, and the strangest move in the arsenal, standing on his back legs and hopping around for a couple of jumps. I don't know how to feel about this one. I think he's supposed to be taking the aspect of a rabbit, but it looks a little silly. But one detail I absolutely adore actually comes after the fight, where the player can look around and see the now dead corpses of every animal that was wandering the area. I love this detail. It ends the fight on such an uncomfortable note, and is one of those patented From Software am I the baddie moments. I took points away from the Ancestor Spirit for ruining some of the shock from the real encounter with the Spirit here, and I think the Regal Ancestor Spirit does earn an A grade. If the story were a bit clearer and tugged on the heartstrings more, or if the challenge was a little higher, it might bump into S grade, but it doesn't quite get there. Do you remember in that Dark Souls 3 video when I was talking about how the Demon Prince's first phase used movesets and clear animations to create one of the most fair and balanced duo fights in any Souls-like game against large spectacle-focused enemies? And that I hoped that Elden Ring would take notes and improve on the idea? That was foreshadowing for the Valiant Gargoyles, who take the personal cake for me as the single worst duo fight in Elden Ring. Everything that the Demon Prince did correctly, the Gargoyles did wrong. The Demon's attacks may have looked chaotic, but once you dodged through the barrage, they'd continue their attack, giving you an easy moment to yourself. The Gargoyles pivot aggressively, meaning every combo has multiple points that need to be specifically dodged. And with the Gargoyles' height, it also means they're harder to both keep on screen than the lower to the ground demons. The demons also had a built-in off switch, where they'd swap in and out of aggressive phases, and always made it clear when they were becoming aggressive. The Gargoyles, meanwhile, do have one passive move, but there's no way to tell which one plans to be passive and when. And when they combine with moves that cover a huge difference incredibly fast, it becomes a lot harder to react to an off-screen Gargoyle. Both of which also hit harder than the Prince's first phases did. Now, of course, this balancing difference is because there is no second phase within the Gargoyles, but it still leads to some frustrating situations. Which loops me back around to that passive move, their Poison Breath. And my god, this move is irritating. With the visual tell very easily being off-screen if you're next to the Gargoyle, the cloud starts dealing tick damage and building up poison instantly instead of using a delay like the Toxic of the demons did. On top of that, the edges of the cloud are not well telegraphed. It's a general area where you'll be taking damage, and it extends past the visual area pretty significantly a lot of the time. On top of that, each of the Gargoyles' movesets are fine in a vacuum, but designed for a single boss fight, not a duo. Each of them have two versions of their weapon and have these huge sweeping transformation attacks that do a ton of damage while transforming and then change the entire moveset. The movesets all have different timings and delays on the basic attacks, and their own unique way to close distance quickly. Some have charges, some have leaps, some have ranged attacks. There is so much in this fight that it becomes almost impossible for it to play out without at least something being unfair to dodge. Like the Bell Gargoyles before them, the fight starts with just one Gargoyle, with the second arriving after the first is under half health. Unlike the Bell Gargoyles, the Valiant Gargoyles are late mid-game opponents, which means this fight is designed to last longer, and the option of rushing one down is much harder to reach when properly leveled. It's still possible, but especially with the movement the Gargoyles are capable of, it's nowhere near as smooth as the first variation. The Valiant Gargoyles are not just a bad duo fight, they are a baffling duo fight. Everything done wrong here is something that From Software has done right before. Perfect health scaling with the Bell Gargoyles, clear movesets and aggression from the demons. Hell, even the afflicted grave robbers in Dark Souls 2 had things in their arena that made it possible to separate them from each other, even if for a moment. The Valiant Gargoyles does nothing to help. It feels so under-designed. Like the two mobs were haphazardly smashed together with no thought of how it would feel to play for a great enemy, no less. Earning an F grade, this is my least favorite fight in Elden Ring, and I absolutely wish that there was nothing important or fun behind them, because if I could avoid fighting them, I always would. And coming in at the big 100, we finally get the first real boss fight against a Crucible Knight. No Twist Snail this time, this is an honest Crucible Knight. Solaria is the only named Crucible Knight in the game, and uses the spear variation of the enemy, which I always found to be the easier of the two varieties. The lack of the shield means the player has a lot more control over the tempo of the fight, rather than needing to find the few moments they can land hits. Quick aside on this one too, people did mention that you can abuse the counter attack that you get from attacking the Crucible Knight's shield to put the momentum back in your corner. With only 4600 health, Solaria is one of the least tanky bosses in Nokron, whereas the first Crucible Knight had one of the highest health pools in total prior to Margit. The first phase's moveset combines a spear's range and pokes with a great club swing to create a really unique and powerful feel. I love the weight that the Spear Crucible Knight's weapon swings with. It makes them one of my favorite elite mobs to deal with. On top of that, the second phase attacks are both really solid. Rather than darting past the player, the flying attack will now target them directly. The damage can be much higher, but punishing the move is much more straightforward. Past that, a charged magic stab with a spear or a magical shoulder check do a great job adding in some evolutions to the standard moveset, while not being as frustrating as the tail could often be. I really love this enemy, and though it's a shorter boss fight, it's a fun, elite version of the fairly standard spear wield. I think Siluria earns a high B grade. It's a fun overworld encounter and a great use of the asset. Fia's Champions asks, what would be better than an easy NPC fight, and it answers, a second one, after the first one finished. Then, after answering its own question, it asks, what would be better than the second NPC fight, and answered, another one with 3 NPCs at once. The 3 NPCs called Fia's Champion, who make up the first wave, and 2 of the 3 champions in the final wave, have static builds that they use when offline, as seen here. But if online, they'll pull from the builds of players who have embraced Fia. Unlike the Mimic tier, their health isn't scaled up, which means the NPCs can drop incredibly fast, even as far as NPCs go. If you're online, you deal with a man with a spear and a small shield, and though he has a solid Ash of War, he still goes down without too much effort. The second wave is always against Sorcerer Roger, who mostly uses his rapier for chip damage and a few collections of soul arrows. Magical NPCs in Elden Ring can get pretty scary, and we'll see that a bit more near the end of part 3 of this series, but Roger doesn't have any spells capable of dealing enough damage to justify his health bar being that thin. The third phase, meanwhile, is always led by Lionel, one of the potential summons for Radahn. He has the most health and good defenses with his rapier, and has the ability to cast tracking magic and create Death Blight, which can be a little scary. The other 2 default builds are a man wielding 2 axes and the Pumpkinhead, which poses a solid damage threat but is pretty easy to get in on an attack, and a sorcerer who likes to stay back and use the short-ranged magical sword. If the sorcerer were to use any actual magic, this phase might be threatening, but Lionel is honestly more of a mage than he is. Though Lionel can take a few hits compared to the others, as soon as the first NPC drops, it's just a matter of time before the next ones follow suit. Fia's Champions earn a low D grade. The idea of taking builds from other players is a fun concept, but too inconsistent to be satisfying, and playing offline leads to builds that feel sloppy. It's an interesting take on the old monk half-light, but it doesn't pay off. Taking the template of the Ancient Dragon and going even further beyond it, Fortissax inherits both the victories and struggles that the Ancient Dragon uses, while adding some exciting and unique mechanics of his own to the mix, making for one of the most customizable dragon fights in the entirety of From Software's library. One of Fortissax's new moves creates a huge bolt of lightning that he plunges into the ground, and as the fight progresses, he eventually creates 2 bolts. When the bolt hits the ground, it creates a fast-moving electric AoE that does heavy damage due to the water in his arena, and can be difficult to roll through, especially when 2 come in rapid succession. Alternatively, if you stayed pressed in close and used Fortissax's own body as cover, his legs will stop the electric wave, making natural gaps in the attack. However, when you go under Fortissax, his lightning aura puts a bolt on you. After a short time, this bolt will crash down, requiring you to internalize the timing and roll. This doesn't just happen during the AoE too, this is every time you go under Fortissax, which is trying to discourage the player from doing what I'm doing right now. But at the same time, Fortissax also has a new attack where he calls down Death Lightning, leaving death clouds everywhere in the arena except the area directly around where he stood. And with the space restricted, the best place to hide is under the dragon, pushing the player back in. But there's still more. Fortissax's head, if you can hit it, takes double damage from the rest of his body, and with 12,903 health, if you do fight him here in the mid-game, that can be a huge boon. This pulls you back out to the front. Now, though it may seem like Fortissax is dragging the player between 2 styles, no threat or boon is so great that it makes any location impossible to use. Using Fortissax's body to dodge his AoEs and fire feels great for the trade-off of regular lightning, but higher damage and the lack of lightning makes fighting him from the front rewarding, even if you also put yourself at greater risk of Death Blight. This is something that a lot of the standard dragons and ancient dragons felt like they were missing for me. There wasn't any reason to ever stay in front of them because it was safer to be behind and hit their ankles. You may technically get more damage, but more damage doesn't matter if it's safer. In Dark Souls 3, Midir made it very clear that you were supposed to attack his head. Almost every attack he did ended with the head on his ground and ready to be hit by a weapon. There was no RNG that could pop up that would make it difficult to get these hits in. On top of that, All of his attacks under him were almost impossible to reliably dodge because of how fast they'd come out compared to attacks when you were in front of him. Elden Ring's more chaotic after effects and head movement in the dragons means that windows are present but far less clear prior to complete mastery. Designs like Fortissaxes that vary the specific challenge and benefit of both styles of combat are so much more fun to engage with. With that said, Fortissax is only in part 2 of this video, and he is the final required boss for unlocking Fia's ending. And though it works well if fought at the proper level, it is really easy to find Fortissax while violently overleveled and stomp him instantly. To the point that when most people found him the first time, that's exactly what happened. He got stomped and the detailed moveset was left unseen. I also want to shout out his music. As I mentioned with Radahn, Elden Ring's music was a bit hit or miss for me. But outside of the Godskin, the Lichdragon was another of those themes that perfectly captured the fight for me. It hasn't got the scale or specific intent of some other themes, but it sells the power of this dragon perfectly. I also love Fortissax for how he evolves Midir's concept. Even if I may enjoy the battle with Midir more personally, I think Fortissax still earns an A grade. On my next run, I am planning to, like with the other dragons, focus on only hitting his head, since though it has clearer windows here than it does on the main dragons, I haven't ever really taken that approach. And heading to Mount Gelmir, we get another boss encounter with an ulcerated tree spirit, and for the first time as a boss, we face it in the overworld at the minor Erdtree in the region. Frankly, I'm not sure why it took this long, because this enemy works much better outdoors. The ulcerated tree spirit still moves wildly and is hard to keep entirely on camera, but the moveset feels a lot better with the space to move and flail, rather than pressing itself against the walls constantly. Especially his grab attack where he slides back into a huge charge forward looks really good outdoors. The corpses around the arena and barricades that the spirit will almost instantly tear through also give the spirit a power presence that it didn't quite reach in the limited dungeon space. Long story short, the tree spirit was meant to be fought outdoors, and this fight displays that really well. Bizarrely though, it's a lot less powerful than the Caelid variant, coming in at only 11,191 compared to Caelid's almost 18,000. I suppose it's because the Caelid version is a little harder to find in the catacombs than the overworld variant, but Mount Gelmir and Caelid are usually pretty neck and neck in terms of challenge and scale, with Mount Gelmir usually being the more difficult. With that said, it's still an ulcerated tree spirit. It's not a great fight to look at, and though the moveset has that great inherent rhythm to it, it's never going to be the highlight of anyone's playthrough. It also feels like it crumbles a little too fast, especially when other boss variations felt like some of the heaviest hitters in their regions. I still think it earns a C grade, coming in just behind the Caelid variant. I prefer the outdoor setting, and with some more health, I think it could come in first, but it just doesn't have the weight the enemy needs to pose enough of a threat. And almost as if to prove my point that the tree spirit's health is unusually low, the Magma Wyrm in Fort Laid, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, has over 12,000 health, getting close to double the 7,000 that the entry to Altus Plateau and Caelid variations came to the table with. Like Makar, this Wyrm has the second phase, where he puts fire on his weapon and stands up. Usually being an overworld encounter means there's more space to move, but this Wyrm is placed directly between a lava pool it climbed out of and a raised slope of rocks that make it hard to back away without jumping at the proper place. I find myself moving around a lot less here than I did in Makar's large area, because the terrain creates a surprisingly restrictive space, especially when mixed with the lava effects. With no new twists, the fight doesn't stick out too much, but I think the increase in stats makes it a solid rematch with Makar, earning another B grade. It does make the fact that Makar has a name feel a little silly if this random Wyrm can do exactly the same thing, but Makar was never out here winning points for atmosphere and shock value like the Ancestor Spirit. The full-grown Fallingstar beast is one of the most notorious bosses in Elden Ring, and not for the best reasons. There are two ways to get up to the arena, a very long ladder or using Torrent to take a wind tunnel up. As anyone who's used Torrent can tell you, the beast has a bad habit of deciding to charge immediately forward and knock you back off the arena before you have a chance to even dismount, as you get up there for the first time. Though this final Fallingstar beast does not have any walls that its charge can get stuck against, it has one of the single most sloped arenas in Elden Ring, and though it's hard to put into words exactly what this does to the beast's moveset, it makes everything feel off. Its attacks don't get too strange in terms of timing, but there's something about fighting on this steep Dutch-angled slope that makes me almost queasy, and the beast pretty reliably finishes his moves almost always on the slope. The increase in health here is also really substantial, even more than the Magma Wyrm, going from 4,500 in Caelid to 7,000 in the Plateau to now 13,000 health, making it again even more strange that the ulcerated tree spirit decreased in health. There is a second phase here unique to the fully grown beast, adding 2 more attacks. One is a cool looking AoE that creates an area without gravity, potentially lifting the player into it, before bringing the rocks and the player with them crashing down to the ground for a final hit. It feels like a natural progression of the rock summoning that already exists, and plays into the astral theme of gravity in a really fun way. The second is a laser beam that starts to the beast's left and swings forward to a straight line. It looks neat, but once you realize it won't go past that center line, it becomes a little too predictable. I wish there were some more variations, going the opposite direction, drawing a complete line instead of stopping. Things like that could have gone a long way to making this attack just a little more engaging. I don't think the boss is horrid, but it definitely lingers behind the best beasts due to the arena. It's just too disorientating. Though it has great storytelling, it's not the best place to fight the beast. I think it earns a solid C grade, landing right in the middle of Elden Ring's roster. Margot continues to make Mount Gelmir's balance feel really strange. The full-grown Fallingstar beast and Magma Wyrm make this feel like the highest mid-level area before you plunge into the capital, but then you get fights like this, and well, Margit had more health, and he only had 4,100. Margot has 3,971, but is also in the late mid-game. Somehow, despite the incredibly low health total, Margot has 2 phases. The first features her on her hind legs using her staff for some weak magical spells and fast melee swings. With the arena on the smaller side, it's pretty unlikely you'll get the chance to see the magic, and instead just see the fairly ineffective and low damage swings. After taking a few hits, and I mean a few, she transitions really quickly here. She'll throw the staff away and become fully feral. The moveset has a bit more of a threat here with quick bites, a long lunge, and a cinematic leaping attack, but despite a solid moveset, the boss is held back by its health bar. On top of that, the demi-human queens in the overworld are built around hordes of their mobs. The fact she's alone here feels wrong. The demi-human queen Margot earns a D grade. It's a really strange boss encounter, especially considering what boss is about to come next in our list. That next boss, of course, is the demi-human queen Maggie. That's right, we've already got another one, but this time an outdoor variation that has an uncomfortably modern name for a giant dog-faced human lady. Maggie has a few mobs supporting her here, a few mages that will harass the player with soul arrows, and a few smaller demi-humans that don't provide too much physical threat. With the player being at range, however, we get to actually see Maggie use some of that magic, which does come out fast enough to get a few cheeky hits on the player while they're cleaning up the mobs. That said, none of the mobs are threatening enough to require them to be beaten, and the damage here is still pretty low compared to fights like the Fallingstar beast. Maggie doesn't have the second phase change either, meaning once she's alone, you have the not too threatening melee staff moveset as your only obstacle to winning. She also staggers so easily that I was actually caught off guard by the knockdown and forgot to use it. Despite only one phase and having a group of mobs, Maggie also has more hit points than Margot. Margot couldn't even break 4,000, but Maggie comes in with 7,500. Now, it may still not be much compared to the other Mount Gelmir bosses, but it is a baffling difference. In a game with so many repeated bosses, these ones are some of the strangest. The combined proximity and variation in stats is just really funky. With that said, Maggie is more entertaining, even if she poses little risk. I think she sits at a C grade, serving as a unique overworld threat prior to a grace. For the second time now, the Misbegotten warrior has joined a friend to try and pose a solid mid-game threat, and this is the only time that I prefer a Perfumer to a Crucible Knight. Perfumers have a few attacks. First, they can conjure bubbles on themselves and allies that make the player deal significantly less damage on their next attack. They can also increase the damage dealt by other enemies around them, and have delayed fire explosive attacks that are great at staggering a player in place. On top of that, a light shield means they're good at avoiding hit and run tactics, while still having an easy to break stance overall, meaning they're easy to punish. Now this footage is really sloppy, but the player has two choices: face the warrior with the buffs and the harrying of the Perfumer, or try to get the Perfumer down first. Usually the choice in these fights is to take out the buffer, but once you look at the stats here, it starts to tell a bit of a different story. The warrior is incredibly good at closing the distance, meaning it's hard to rack up damage fast on the Perfumer without being interrupted. And with only 3,500 health, even the Perfumer's buffs means it's still fragile for Mount Gelmir and can be pretty easily faced. Once he's down, the Perfumer doesn't even have 1,000 hit points, a low health total only surpassed by the Soldier of God, Rick. Even the Beastman Afer Mazula and Scaly Misbegotten have more health than she does, which feels feels bizarre. With a bit more health, I think this could be a really fun challenge, though the low health unfortunately means that footage like this is still rewarded with a win, which is a shame. I think it still earns a C grade. With enough health, I could see this fight scoring much higher, but it just feels underwhelming in its current state, even with a fun mix of bosses. And following a more thought-out duo pair with underwhelming health, we have a much lazier duo pair with underwhelming health. The Kindred of Rot are simple mobs, they have some glaive swings with a decent range, and primarily use a multi-hit ranged attack to serve as almost level obstacles in the dungeons they appear in. They feel a lot like much weaker of the Ringed City Angels with a melee attack, but level obstacles that make exploring a dungeon or region more challenging are not the enemy types that translate well into a boss fight. With just over 2,000 health each and no real threat once you're in melee, it's pretty easy to treat these as mobs. There's a poison ring like with the Cleanrot Knights, but the Kindred of Rot go down so much faster and are so much worse at putting melee pressure on the player that it plays even less of a role here. I think the Kindred of Rot earn a D grade. Again, the biggest issue here is that the Kindred of Rot are designed as obstacles on a level to use stealth against, not as a combat challenge. Giving them a health bar and removing the option to stealth doesn't change that. Yet another duo battle, the Abductor Virgins are a much more combat-focused challenge, and the usual strategy to beat them individually is complicated a lot by it being a duo fight. Usually, the Virgin's most dangerous grabs and attacks will open the cage, allowing you to strike it for a massive amount of damage, and with the second Virgin attacking, it's usually much harder to punish that cage. With that said, the health of the Virgins is intentionally on the lower side compared to other bosses in Gelmir, coming in at 3,800 each. But like Makar was a potential path in the Plateau, the Virgins serve as a potential path into the back of Mount Gelmir. If you're kidnapped in Liurnia, you can unlock fast travel just before this fight, and like in Bloodborne with the Dark Beast, you can fight what would be an overwhelming boss fight for that point in the early game. After a few levels though the fight can still output solid damage, the threat is significantly lessened, allowing you to loop back around. Also unlike the Dark Beast, fighting the Virgins early gets you to the Volcano Manor, which is required for a ton of NPC quests, and has a ton of powerful loot available, which means beating the Virgins early is massively rewarded. Each of the movesets also provide a unique threat, which time out enough to stop the movesets from constantly overlapping. Not to say they won't overlap, they'll overlap a lot, but they share no moves, which keeps things from ever being too frustrating. Of course, this is also after the nerf. I know this one was also hit by it. One has scythes for arms, focusing on spins for long-ranged attacks or a mid-range physical threat you can push through for damage, and the other has spiked wheels, trying to roll over the player. The varied range works really well here. I targeted the scythe arms first so I could stay in melee against the wheel version, but drawing the wheels away to take it down is an equally valid strategy. Like I said, this is one of the other fights that got nerfed, but unlike the Crystallians, it got nerfed to a pretty good place, earning a B grade. The Virgins are a threat to low-level builds, serving as a good damage check, but aren't so hard as to be unrealistic for a properly leveled character. The movesets overlap, but the variation allows for some interesting choice, and there are a few things as fun as being able to finally sneak in that massive hit. I swear this wasn't intentional, but with 3 bosses left in the video, one of the last bosses in part 2 is another Red Wolf. This time the Red Wolf of the Champion. Whereas the first one had a very clear defined purpose in its arena, this one is in a much stranger place. The moveset is still solid. The overlap of arrows and melee still works really well, though the larger arena sadly means the wolf more frequently jumps away far enough that it can't reach you again as quickly. It's a bit of a frustrating nerf, removing some of that visceral pacing that the first wolf had. And though it's certainly possible to run into this wolf first, the first wolf being on the path to a remembrance means it's not likely. On top of the arena not working as well for combat, the atmosphere also suffers here. A school was a really unique setting for a fight with a giant magical dog. The bottom of a grave catacomb feels a bit strange. Not in the wolf guarding a grave way, that obviously works well, but the wolf being at the bottom of a lava-filled dungeon with undead kind of way. And, like almost exactly half of the Mount Gelmir bosses, the Red Wolf of the Champion is made out of paper. The first Red Wolf was intentionally fragile with 2,200 health, but despite a collection of another 50-odd bosses, the Red Wolf of the Champion only has 3,100 health. This is an area opening with bosses with over 13,000 health, and though I'm very glad the Red Wolf does not have that much health, 3,100 is way too low for one of the harder dungeons in Mount Gelmir's boss fight. The enemy is still fun, but with everything the Red Wolf of the Champion is missing, I can't give it above a B grade. It's an underwhelming rematch, though it doesn't sour the enemy. The second half of the Godskin duo, the Noble, gets another solid introduction, even if it lacks the flair of the Godskin Apostle in the Windmill, and unfortunately, the Noble is the lesser of the pair by a decent margin. He's not a bad opponent, but his design leans a little too much towards goofy for my personal tastes. Like the Apostle, the Noble has some ranged fire attacks, but has a much more straightforward melee moveset with a rapier. The 3 tempos of lunges are also really well communicated to the player here. There's one incredibly fast one, a really long lunge forward, and a more standard swing, all of which are really clear to read. Past that, he has a few general get-off-me swings or backhands that make a melee moveset feel complete and simple. Where the Noble falls short of his brethren is the second phase, where he inflates and begins to roll around the arena for a while. Like the Fallingstar beast in the mine, the Noble is constantly getting stuck on pillars and walls and everything, meaning the attack is rarely satisfying to dodge. And on top of that, it just looks silly. If I told you there was a boss called the Godskin Noble that wore the skin of dead gods, would you guess that it would stick its thumb in its mouth and below to turn into a giant sentient wheel? Because that feels silly, and as this music makes clear, this is not a silly fellow. I also want to point out the power pose he lands here. He wants to look so cool finishing this off, like he didn't just spend the last 13 seconds as a sentient rolling blob. The improvements on the rest of the moveset are a bit better. A huge AoE butt slam does provide a decent threat to force the player back, and summoning a persistent fire ring to create space looks cool and can provide the opportunity to reset the fight. Combined with hilt slams that can provide a great window to punish or put the player into a knockdown that they'll have to escape if they don't get out of the way in time, adds a really dynamic feel. He also gets a triple lunge with his rapier, which does add another exciting twist to his variety of lunges. It's the most dangerous one, but also leaves the biggest opening yet. And leaving openings is actually something this boss does really well. He has fast moves and combo starters that are hard to punish, but the huge thrusts and slams always leave a plentiful window afterwards. On the matter of atmosphere, it ends up a little counterintuitive. The red-lit room with blood-red carpet theoretically matches the atmosphere of the Noble, and his music better than the Windmill Village fit the Apostle, but that's exactly the problem. The Apostle felt so malevolent and demented in the Bright Plateau, where this atmosphere matches a lot more. That doesn't mean it's bad, it's a great arena for the Noble, but it doesn't make you uncomfortable like the Village did. The Noble boasts a solid health bar, coming in at just about 10,000 health. It goes down like butter here, but a weakness to bleed and slashing damage really caused the Noble to get absolutely smashed by this build. Elden Ring in general has a lot more abusable weaknesses, and this build almost perfectly counters this boss, and considering he lasted as long as some bosses with less than half his health in the same area, this is a great place to point that out. The Noble earns a B grade. It doesn't carry the wow factor of the Apostle, but is still a solid challenge, and like the Red Wolf before Rennala, is a great stat check before facing the Remembrance of Mount Gelmir, and our final boss of today's video. Back in Dark Souls 3, when we faced Wyrm, he struggled to provide enough depth to be satisfying. Once you had the Storm Ruler, it was just a matter of using one move a couple of times, and that's it. The fight's done. This moveset was simple, and there wasn't anything to catch you off guard throughout the fight. And that's been an issue with a lot of puzzle bosses throughout the series. That is, until what is undoubtedly the single best gimmick fight in From Software's library, and potentially one of the best gimmick fights in any action game I've played, Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. Like other remembrances, Rykard stands heads and shoulders above the rest of the area before him, but in Rykard's case, it's literal. After picking up the Serpent Hunter, the player has plenty of time to change their equipment, and considering the area's focus on snakes and the size of the giant snake-like creature before you, it's pretty clear what you're supposed to do here. Inside this arena, the Serpent Hunter gains a unique wind moveset, massively extending its entire range and damage to absurd amounts. It also has a great built-in challenge mode. You can choose to leave and upgrade the Serpent Hunter as much as you see fit. If you're struggling, you can just go out and get the ingredients necessary. There's also still a lot of potential build variety here. If you use shields especially, you can one-hand the Serpent Hunter and use the shield and shield counters with a giant wind wave, and that feels so incredibly cool. The God-devouring Serpent is surrounded by a pool of lava, which serves as the main discouragement to get players to use the range of the Serpent Hunter. With that said, it doesn't make damaging him impossible. I have a friend that, in his absolute madness, beat him with a Flamberge using jump attacks and relying on the bleed to deal huge percentage chunks of the health bar. 12 of his 14 flasks went exclusively to healing from the lava, so it's pretty significantly discouraged. The Serpent's moveset is pretty straightforward, all things considered. It bites, spits some poison, or splashes lava up at the player, but there's nothing here that'll catch you too off guard. This is very much a warm-up first phase, focused on getting the player used to the moveset and the gimmick within it. To give you an idea of the numerical scale of the fight with the Serpent Hunter though, the God-Devouring Serpent has somewhere around 30,000 health that needs to be reduced in order to reach the fight proper. Once he goes down, you're introduced to Rite, who it turns out has permanently moved into the neck of this giant snake. He then engages in a little body horror, reaching into the mouth of what you thought was a dead snake to pull out a sword from its throat, covered in pieces of flesh that fall off into the lava, before he delivers one of the most uncomfortable sounding lines in From Software's library.
Join myself and King as remedy. Together we will devour the very god.
The words itself aren't too creepy, but the performance here lands right in between goofy and uncomfortable. As he forces every unique syllable out, you can't help but laugh a little because he's so inhuman and off that it feels wrong. There's been a lot of spectacle in the remembrances. Gondrick was pretty straightforward, but Rennala took you to a magical arena, and Radahn turned into a meteorite in the middle of his fight, but the scale happening here is absurd. Rykard has close to another 60,000 more hit points to work through, and he not only keeps the snake's whole moveset as a starting point, reanimating the usually limp snake to attack with it, and more intentionally lifting himself for the lava splash, but he has a ton of new attacks. Now armed with a sword, he has long swings, slams, and stabs forward, as well as a collection of new spells. Cones of flame that need to be dodged, flying skulls that track down the player before exploding, and he's much more mobile, always pressing against the player, sometimes even pushing them against the wall in a pretty sizable arena. But when he reaches his second phase, he gains what I consider the single most incredible looking attack in the base game. Opening a rift above him, flaming skulls start to hunt the player as he continues to swing and press forward. The blacks of the room give way to the overwhelming hellish orange as more and more skulls start to reach the player. And as the attack finally comes to a close, he raises his sword into the rift before bringing it down. The attack creates so many effects and is of such a massive scale that it feels like it consumes the entire arena and replaces it. Everything around you has been converted, lost with the scale of this magic. It feels and looks incredible. The rift is horrifying, and with the twisting snake rising up to reach it before slamming down, it's just incredible. But what I find most impressive is how customizable they managed to make this gimmick fight. Your entire moveset is open here, so whether you're using your standard R1 attacks, heavy attacks, jump attacks, shield counters, magic enhancement, or anything else, it all works. And with the weapon being additionally upgradable, there's a naturally built-in difficulty challenge that the fight is structured around, letting the designers really go all out on giving Rykard the deep and satisfying moveset that he has today. It captures spectacle, uses the gimmick to make the fight feel unlike anything else in the game, and still feels like an Elden Ring boss. And that's the big thing that so many gimmick bosses so frequently miss. This is a gimmick fight and a boss fight. The line in the sand drawn by so many that came before is gone, and it is absolutely breathtaking. Though the simple and straightforward nature of Godrick still hits perfectly for me, Rykard is a close contender for that top spot with another S grade. There are plenty of bosses in the mid-game of Elden Ring that struggle to find their balance point, but the 4 remembrances that build up to the Royal Capital are consistently the highest quality boss fights in Elden Ring, justifying their own areas beautifully. But with that, our second video comes to an end, 113 bosses into the roster. Originally, I thought that if the DLC only had 15 or so bosses, I could fit it into a long part 3, but as I record this outro, already 15 bosses into that DLC with only 3 remembrances and half the map unlocked, that's not going to be happening. So, next time we'll finish off the base game of Elden Ring before diving into the DLC as part 4 to this series, because oh my goodness, there is so much happening there. I also want 2 playthroughs of the DLC before I analyze it, so hopefully that'll time out with about the time I'm finishing editing part 3. Either way, thanks for joining me today. I do want to shout out that I split my channel just before starting this Elden Ring series, with my other channel focusing primarily on Pathfinder 2e content. The season finale of Call of the Ocean, our first actual play game, is dropping on July 28th. If you or anyone you know likes tabletop actual plays, come send them towards us. We like focusing on small stories that have a beginning, middle, and end in each season, usually within 15 to 20 episodes is going to be the goal. The channel link is in the description below. But for now, I have one more part to finish this base game off. The end game of Elden Ring, where everything really comes to a head, and the small boss fight starts to give way to huge climaxes. We'll be doing the Lake of Rot, the Dragon Barrow, the Capital, the Mountaintop of Giants, the Consecrated Ground, Fair Missoula, and the Ashen Capital. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next installment. Duo fights against the smaller bosses. Variations in horizontal sword swings. So preparing, and like all the other plateau bosses with that amount, the player can almost effortlessly She may lack the bulk of the earlier dragons shitting. Yep, that's what she's doing. Will you guess that it sticks its thumb in its mouth and blows itself into a giant That's not a good sentence.